There is a dinosaur outside your window tonight. Not a fossil preserved in stone, not a reconstruction assembled from fragments in the basement of a natural history museum, not something that requires the suspension of disbelief or the careful assistance of imagination to picture. Simply a living, breathing, warm-blooded animal resting on whatever ledge or branch or rooftop the evening has provided, entirely unconcerned with the fact that you are lying here in the dark, thinking about it. We call it a bird, and that short and ordinary word has been quietly concealing something extraordinary for as long as anyone has been using it. Because birds are not the distant cousins of dinosaurs, they are not animals that branched away from the dinosaur family tree and then went their own separate way across the millennia. They are dinosaurs, completely and taxonomically, and without any metaphor involved whatsoever. Members in good standing of the same family that walked and hunted and nested and raised their young on this planet for 165 million uninterrupted years. The pigeon that landed on the nearest ledge this afternoon and regarded the street below with its particular sideways calm was a dinosaur going about an ordinary afternoon. The sparrow that passed through the highest branches of whatever tree stands closest to wherever you are resting tonight was a theropod dinosaur conducting its mourning in the same lineage as every great animal that has ever made a child stop walking in a museum and simply stare. The robin, whose call arrived through the window in the first pale minutes of this morning, before the day had properly committed to being a day, was a warm-blooded, feathered, hollow-boned member of the most successful group of land animals this planet has ever produced. And it was singing as it always sings, completely indifferent to the 66 million years of geological and biological change that separates its particular morning from the morning when its ancestors watched an asteroid cross the late Cretaceous sky and did not know what it was. The dinosaurs did not end. One lineage of small, feathered, warm-blooded theropods survived the long winter that followed the Chicxulub impact and the slow collapse and eventual recovery of the food web in the years after that. And the entire 66 million years of continental drift and climate shift and ecological transformation that followed, arriving eventually at this particular evening in an unbroken line of descent that connects whatever bird is resting outside your window right now to the animals we are going to spend the next 3.5 hours exploring together. They have been here every morning of your entire life, calling from the branches before the alarm sounded, passing across the sky while you moved through the business of your days, resting on ledges and wires, and the highest points of every building in every city that has ever been built on land that was, for a very long time before the cities arrived, their domain entirely. The dinosaurs never left. They simply found a smaller, lighter, warmer, more aerodynamically efficient form, and continued. Tonight, we are going to travel back through the 66 million years that separate this evening from the moment of that continuation, and back through the 100 million years before that, into the longest and most extraordinary sustained chapter of animal life this planet has ever hosted. A world that lasted 186 million years, which is a span of time so vast that the entire history of our own species, from the first stone tool to this particular moment of you lying in the dark, represents less than a single breath taken at the very end of it. The Mesozoic era has been waiting, with the complete and patient indifference of deep geological time, for 66 million years. It is in absolutely no hurry, and neither are you. You do not need to stay awake for this journey, because the journey is not the kind that requires your eyes to be open or your mind to be tracking every detail or any part of you to do anything at all, except allow the weight of very old time to settle gently over you the way it settles over everything, eventually, without asking permission and without requiring anything in return. So allow your body to settle now, fully and without reservation, into wherever it rests tonight, and allow the cool and quiet dark of the room around you to simply be what it is. The same darkness that has always fallen over this planet at the end of every day. The same darkness that fell over the Cretaceous forests and the Jurassic floodplains and the strange and ancient Triassic world, where the very first dinosaurs were finding their first tentative footing on a supercontinent that had not yet decided to become the world we recognize. We begin before the beginning. Not at the moment the first dinosaur set its three-toed foot upon the ground of what would eventually become South America. Not at the first morning of the Triassic world, where everything that came after had its tentative and unhurried origin, but further back still, further back than most minds instinctively reach when they try to find the start of this particular story, into a world so different from the one we know that the land itself had not yet separated into the shapes that any map you have ever looked at would show you. 252 million years ago. Allow that number to simply rest somewhere in the quieter regions of your mind, without asking you to do anything with it, without requiring that you hold it clearly, or convert it into any unit of experience that your ordinary sense of time could comfortably accommodate, because it cannot be accommodated in that way. It is simply too large, too patient, too entirely indifferent to the scale of a single human life for the ordinary machinery of daily thought to process without softening. And that softening is precisely where we are going tonight. 252 million years ago, the Earth was a single world, not divided into the continents you would recognize from any classroom wall, or any satellite image taken from the altitude where the curvature of the planet first becomes visible, but gathered, all of it, into one continuous landmass that geologists call Pangaea, a word that means simply all the Earth, pressed together, surrounded on every side by a single vast and warm ocean that covered everything the land did not. The interior of Pangaea was enormous in a way that is difficult to fully picture. And when land stretches unbroken for thousands of kilometers in every direction, with no coastline within reach to moderate the temperature or supply the moisture that coastlines always carry inland with them, the result is a climate of extraordinary character. Summers of sustained, radiating heat, winters of profound stillness, and through both seasons a dryness so complete that the red rock of the interior, resting under a sun that was already ancient by this point in its long and patient life, gave the entire central region of Pangaea the quality of a world still finding its way toward the version of itself that could comfortably support the extraordinary diversity of life that was about to emerge from it. But in the periods before the story we are telling tonight, this world was already full of life. The Permian period, the age that immediately preceded the Triassic, the age whose aftermath the dinosaurs would inherit, was a world of extraordinary complexity and richness, populated by animals that occupied many of the same ecological roles that dinosaurs would later fill, doing so with their own particular forms and strategies and adaptations, refined across millions of years of slow and patient evolutionary time. There were large herbivores moving through the Permian forests in slow herds, cropping the vegetation of ancient seed ferns and primitive conifers with the same methodical patience that the great sauropods would later bring to the Jurassic. Though their bodies were built along different lines, lower to the ground, barrel-shaped and wide, moving with the particular unhurried deliberateness of animals that have enough food and enough space and no particular urgency about anything at all. There were smaller creatures too, insect eaters, omnivores, the early ancestors of the mammals that would eventually inherit a transformed world, moving through the undergrowth and the leaf litter of the Permian forests in the small and quiet and largely unnoticed way that small creatures have always moved through the undergrowth of whatever world they happen to find themselves in. It was, in its own way, a complete and balanced and fully functioning world. And then, across a span of time that the geological record registers as relatively brief by the standards of the vast timescales we are moving through tonight, it ended. Not in any single catastrophic moment that could be located on a timeline and pointed to and named as the moment everything changed, but slowly across thousands of centuries through a process so gradual that any individual generation of animals living through it would have experienced nothing more dramatic than the ordinary variability of seasons and years, while the world around them shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward conditions it had never held before. The volcanic systems underlying what is now Siberia had been active for a very long time, and they released their gases, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other compounds that the Permian atmosphere was not accustomed to receiving in such sustained and patient quantities. Not in a single eruption of the kind that makes news and fills skies with ash, but in a slow and continuous geological exhalation that lasted, with varying intensity, for perhaps 1 million years, adding its chemical contribution to the atmosphere of the planet in the same unhurried way that the planet has always conducted its largest and most consequential processes. The atmosphere warmed. The oceans, absorbing the warmth of an atmosphere holding more heat than it had held before, warmed in turn. And as they warmed, the oxygen dissolved within them became scarcer, retreating from the shallower waters where most marine life had always lived, persisting only in the coldest and deepest regions of the ocean, where the temperature still held it in solution, and the great marine communities of the Permian, the reefs, the shallow seas thick with the extraordinary diversity of invertebrate life that the Permian oceans had been cultivating for millions of years, began, slowly and without drama, to thin. On land, the warming and the drying continued its patient work across the centuries, and the forests that had sustained the great herbivores retreated, and the herbivores followed the forests, and the smaller creatures moved through a world that was offering them a little less than it had offered their parents, and a little less than that to their offspring, and less still to the generation after that, in the slow and entirely undramatic arithmetic of ecological change. By the time the worst of it had passed, by the time the volcanic exhalations had finally slowed enough for the planet's chemistry to begin the long process of rebalancing itself, somewhere between 70 and 96% of all species that had existed in the Permian were gone. What the rock tells us, clearly and consistently, is that the world that emerged from the end of the Permian was a quieter world than the one that preceded it. A world with fewer species, fewer ecological roles occupied, fewer of the complex interdependencies that a fully developed biosphere accumulates across millions of years of life building upon life. The survivors were, for the most part, small. Small bodies need less food, and in a world where the food web had been so severely disrupted, small was a strategy that worked where large had failed. Small omnivores, small insectivores, small animals capable of eating whatever the recovering world happened to provide, rather than depending on the specific and now absent resources that the more specialized animals of the Permian had required. And among these small survivors, moving through the undergrowth of the early Triassic, in the modest and entirely unassuming way of animals that do not yet know they are about to inherit the Earth, were the ancestors of the dinosaurs. Not the dinosaurs themselves, not yet. The first true dinosaurs would not appear for another 20 million years or so, after the world had recovered enough to support the more complex ecological structures that their larger body plans would require. But the archosaurs, the broader group from which the dinosaurs would eventually emerge, already present in the early Triassic world, already carrying within their bodies the particular arrangement of bones and joints and metabolic strategies that would eventually, across millions of years of slow and patient evolutionary refinement, produce the extraordinary diversity of animals that the Mesozoic era would become famous for. They were small and they were quiet, and the world around them was still in the long and unhurried process of becoming something that could support what they would eventually become. The Triassic night, when it fell over the recovering world, was very still, quieter perhaps than any night this planet has known since. Because the communities of animals that fill a night with sound, the complex and layered chorus of a world in full biological productivity, had not yet recovered to the density and diversity that produces that kind of living sound. Simply the wind moving over the red rock of the Triassic interior, simply the slow sound of water finding its course through a landscape still rearranging itself in the new drainage patterns of a changed world. And somewhere in the undergrowth, in the dark, in the quiet, something small was moving, not yet a dinosaur, but already, in its patient and entirely unhurried way, becoming one. Rest here for a while, in this early and recovering world, before we follow the story forward into the Triassic dawn, where the first true dinosaurs are about to make their quiet and entirely unannounced appearance. The world is very still here. The stars above the Triassic are very steady, the same stars that are outside your window tonight, older now by 252 million years, and still, as they have always been, entirely patient. The world is beginning to recover, not quickly, and not in any way that the animals moving through the early Triassic landscape would have been able to perceive as recovery, because recovery, at the scale of a planetary biosphere rebuilding itself after the most profound biological disruption in the history of complex life, is a process measured in millions of years rather than in seasons or generations or any unit of time that a living creature moving through its daily life could register as change. But the volcanic exhalations that had warmed the Permian atmosphere across their long and patient centuries have begun, at last, to diminish, and the chemistry of the air and the oceans is beginning, slowly and without announcement, to find its way back toward the kind of balance that a complex biosphere requires before it can begin the long work of rebuilding everything that was lost. The early Triassic world, viewed from any altitude that allowed you to see its full extent, would have looked sparse in a way that no landscape alive today quite resembles. Not the dramatic bareness of a desert, which has its own particular and highly specialized communities of life, adapted precisely to the conditions of aridity, but the particular sparseness of a world where the complex layering of species upon species, predator upon prey, decomposer upon the fallen remains of both, had been so thoroughly disrupted that the rebuilding was still, in these earliest centuries of the new era, only just beginning. The forests of the Permian, which had covered enormous stretches of the supercontinent in the dense and complex canopies that the great Permian herbivores had depended upon, were gone in most places, replaced by the pioneering plant communities that are always the first to colonize bare or disturbed ground. Simple ferns, hardy seed plants, the kinds of vegetation that ask very little of the soil they grow in and offer, in return, a thin but real foundation upon which more complex plant communities will eventually, across the patient centuries, begin to establish themselves. The rivers were running, because rivers always run, finding their way through whatever landscape the latest geological chapter has arranged for them, following the logic of gravity through the new drainage patterns of a world whose forests no longer held the soil in place the way mature forests always do, carrying their loads of red sediment through channels that shifted more frequently and more dramatically than the river systems of a more fully vegetated world would have shifted, depositing their sediment in the broad floodplains that would eventually, millions of years later, become some of the most productive fossil beds in the entire paleontological record. And across this recovering, sparsely vegetated, river-crossed world, life was moving carefully in the modest and entirely practical way of animals that have survived a catastrophe, not through any particular heroism or specialization, but through the quiet virtue of being small enough and adaptable enough and undemanding enough of the specific conditions that the old world had provided and the new world had not yet restored. Among these survivors, among the archosaurs we met at the close of our last chapter, those small and upright walking animals that were carrying within their bodies the skeletal arrangements that would eventually produce the dinosaurs. A process was underway that would take another 20 million years to complete, but whose direction was already, in retrospect, apparent in the particular advantages that the Archosaur body plan was beginning to demonstrate in the conditions of the recovering Triassic world. The upright posture was the key to it. Most of the large animals of the Permian had moved with a sprawling gait, their legs extending outward from the sides of their bodies and then bending downward at the knee, the way a lizard moves today, requiring a particular kind of muscular effort to lift the body's weight with each step, and a characteristic lateral undulation of the spine that makes the movement of a large, sprawling animal, when observed at any speed above a slow walk, seem almost effortful in a way that the upright gait does not. The archosaurs and the dinosaurs that would emerge from them had their legs positioned directly beneath their bodies rather than extending from the sides. And this single anatomical arrangement, which seems, described plainly, like a relatively minor structural variation, turned out to carry with it an extraordinary cascade of biological consequences that would reshape the history of life on land for the next 186 million years. An upright animal uses less energy to move at any given speed than a sprawling one, because the muscles required to hold the body's weight are working with the skeleton rather than against it. And this energetic efficiency translates across the daily and seasonal and lifelong arithmetic of survival into a real and compounding advantage in a world where food is still scarce and the distances between food sources are still large. An upright animal can, with certain modifications to the lung structure and the cardiovascular system, sustain higher activity levels for longer periods than a sprawling animal of the same size, because the lateral undulation of the sprawling spine restricts the expansion of the lungs in a way that the upright spine does not. And the Archosaur lineage had already, by the early Triassic, begun the long evolutionary process of developing the more sophisticated respiratory systems that would eventually, in the avian dinosaurs, produce the most efficient breathing apparatus of any vertebrate animal that has ever lived. These were not changes that happened quickly or visibly, or in any way that would have been apparent to any observer watching the early Triassic world go about its quiet, recovering business. They accumulated as all evolutionary changes accumulate, in the slow and patient way of small advantages compounding across thousands of generations into differences, large enough to shift the balance between one lineage and another in the long and unhurried competition for the ecological roles that a recovering world would eventually have available to fill. And then, approximately 230 million years ago, in what is now the Ishigualasto Formation of northwestern Argentina, a place of red and grey badlands today, sculpted by erosion into the particular spare and ancient beauty of land from which everything soft has long since been removed, the first true dinosaurs appeared. They were small. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the first dinosaurs, and the thing most at odds with the image of the dinosaur that popular imagination has settled on, which is almost always large, and often enormous, and frequently dramatic in the particular way that enormous animals are dramatic simply by virtue of the scale they occupy in the world around them. The first dinosaurs were not enormous, and they were not dramatic, and there was nothing about them, seen in the context of the early Triassic world they moved through, that would have suggested to any observer that this modest and unassuming group of upright walking animals was about to embark on one of the most extraordinary sustained runs of biological dominance in the history of life on this planet. Eoraptor is among the earliest known, and it was roughly the size of a medium dog, perhaps a meter long from the tip of its snout to the end of its tail, weighing perhaps 5 or 10 kilograms, moving through the undergrowth of the Triassic on its 2 hind legs with the quick and economical gait of an animal that was fast enough to chase small prey and light enough to change direction without committing its entire body weight to the decision. Its teeth tell us something about the flexibility of its diet. Some of them were leaf-shaped and suited to plant material. Others were curved and serrated in the way of an animal that also ate small animals when small animals were available. The dietary opportunism of an early survivor in a world that had not yet settled into the stable and complex ecological structures that allow a predator to specialize in a single prey type and trust that prey type to always be there. It nested, most likely, in the way that its descendants would nest, with some degree of parental attention to the eggs and the newly hatched young, a behavior that the Archosaur lineage had already developed before the dinosaurs proper appeared, and that the dinosaurs would carry forward in increasingly elaborate forms, all the way to the extraordinarily attentive parental behavior that the birds express today. And it moved through a Triassic landscape that, 230 million years into the planet's history, was beginning to look a little more like a world and a little less like a recovery ward. The ferns and seed plants of the earliest Triassic were being joined, gradually, by the primitive conifers that would come to dominate the later Triassic and the Jurassic, tall, straight-trunked trees with narrow crowns that cast a different quality of shade from the broad-leaved forests of much later periods, a more vertical and columnar shade, the forest floor beneath them receiving the light that filtered through in long, thin shafts, rather than the dappled, shifting pools of a broadleaf canopy. The ginkgos were there too, their fan-shaped leaves already recognizable in the Triassic as the same fan-shaped leaves that the ginkgo trees growing in the parks and streets of cities around the world are still producing today, because the ginkgo is one of those extraordinary plants that found a form so effective, so well suited to the range of conditions it needed to tolerate, that evolution has seen no particular reason to alter it significantly in the 250 million years since its ancestors were dropping their distinctive leaves onto the forest floor of the early Mesozoic. A ginkgo leaf falling in the Triassic looked almost exactly like a ginkgo leaf falling today, which is the kind of thought that, held gently in a quiet mind at the end of a long day, tends to produce a particular quality of expansive, undemanding wonder that is very difficult to distinguish from the feeling of falling asleep. The Triassic world had its insects, considerably reduced in diversity from the Permian, but recovering, always recovering, because insects are among the most resilient forms of life this planet has ever produced. Their small size and rapid generation time and extraordinary reproductive capacity, allowing them to rebuild their populations and their diversity at a pace that the larger animals around them could not match. There were dragonflies, recognizable as dragonflies in the way that the ginkgo leaf is recognizable as a ginkgo leaf. An ancient body plan, finding its form early and seeing little reason to depart significantly from it. Across the deep time of the Mesozoic, resting on the vegetation beside the Triassic rivers in the particular upright stillness that dragonflies have always maintained. Their compound eyes reading the movement of the air and water around them with the same extraordinary sensitivity that their descendants read it today. There were beetles and flies, and the early representatives of the groups that would eventually, in the Cretaceous, when the flowering plants arrived and transformed the chemical and visual landscape of the planet, diversify into the extraordinary abundance of pollinating insects that the modern world depends upon so completely and so unconsciously. But that transformation was still 150 million years away, and the Triassic world, for all its beauty and its quiet recovery, was a world still without flowers, a world whose palette was the palette of ferns and conifers and ginkgos, green in its many shades, but without the extraordinary chromatic diversity that the evolution of the angiosperms would eventually introduce. A world that smelled of resin and water and the particular green freshness of photosynthesizing foliage rather than the complex and varied sweetness of a world full of flowers. The first dinosaurs moved through this flowerless, recovering, quietly rebuilding world in their small and practical way, eating what the Triassic provided and avoiding being eaten by the animals that were larger than them, which in the earliest Triassic included several groups of archosaurs and other reptiles that were, for the moment, more successful than the dinosaurs at occupying the ecological roles of large predator and large herbivore. The dinosaurs were not yet dominant. They would not be dominant in the full and unambiguous sense of occupying the largest ecological roles across the widest range of environments, until the end of the Triassic period, when a second major extinction event, smaller than the Permian catastrophe but significant enough to clear away many of the competing groups that had shared the Triassic world with the early dinosaurs, gave the dinosaur lineage the space to expand into the roles that had been vacated. And the Jurassic period began with the dinosaurs in the ascendant position they would hold for the next 135 million years. But the seeds of that dominance were already present in the Triassic, in the upright posture and the efficient gait, and the metabolic flexibility of these small and modest animals moving through the recovering world of 230 million years ago, going about their daily business with no knowledge of what they were becoming, in the same patient and unconscious way that all evolutionary change proceeds. Not toward anything, not with any direction or intention, simply responding, generation by generation, to the particular conditions of the particular world they happen to find themselves in. The Triassic sun is very low on the horizon now, the evening coming in the long and gradual way of evenings in a world without the atmospheric complexity of a fully developed biosphere. The sky perhaps a slightly different shade of blue than the sky outside your window tonight. The atmospheric chemistry of the Triassic was not quite the atmospheric chemistry of the present, and the particular scattering of light that produces the colors of a sunset is sensitive to those chemical differences in ways that no eye present at the Triassic dusk would have been able to consciously notice. but it was beautiful in its own ancient and unhurried way. The red rock of the floodplains catching the last of the low light and holding it in the particular warm and dusty glow of sandstone at golden hour. The tall, straight shapes of the primitive conifers casting their long shadows across the ground below. The rivers moving in their wide and braided channels through the sediment of the valley floors, catching the evening light in the flat and moving way that shallow water always catches light. And somewhere in the middle distance, moving between the trees in the long shadows of the Triassic evening, a small and upright figure, perhaps a meter long, perhaps weighing no more than the cat that sleeps on someone's bed somewhere in your neighborhood tonight, picking its careful way through the undergrowth toward wherever it was going, toward whatever the Triassic evening was about to provide or withhold, entirely unaware that it was the beginning of something. It simply moved, as living things have always moved, through the world that was available to it, unhurried, patient, following whatever path the evening had arranged through the long shadows of the first dinosaur world. Rest here for a while in this quiet Triassic evening before we follow the story forward into the Jurassic, where the world will be warmer and wetter, and the conifers will have grown into forests of extraordinary density and height. And the animals moving through those forests will be, in every measurable way, far larger than anything moving through the Triassic undergrowth tonight. The Triassic evening is very still. The first dinosaurs are settling into the shadows, and the long and patient work of becoming the age of dinosaurs has, in its quiet and entirely unhurried way, already begun. Sick Dawn, the most relaxing facts about dinosaurs to fall asleep to Chapter 3, The Age of Giants. The Jurassic world. Something has changed in the world. Not the small and incremental change of one generation's circumstances differing slightly from the last. Not the barely perceptible drift of evolutionary adjustment accumulating across the deep time of millions of years in the way we have been following it through the Triassic. Something larger than that, something that has left a clear and unmistakable mark in the rock record of every continent on Earth. A boundary layer that paleontologists can identify in field exposures around the world as the precise moment when one chapter of the Mesozoic ended and another, richer, stranger, and more extraordinary chapter began. The Triassic-Jurassic boundary, another extinction, smaller than the catastrophe at the end of the Permian, but significant enough. Across the 200,000 years or so over which it unfolded, to clear away a considerable portion of the competing groups that had shared the Triassic world with the early dinosaurs. The large crurotarsal archosaurs that had occupied the roles of dominant predator and large herbivore across much of the Triassic, along with many of the other reptile groups that had been, for the duration of the Triassic period, at least as successful as the dinosaurs at making a living in the recovering post-Permian world. What caused this second major disruption is still debated, though the evidence points most strongly toward another episode of massive volcanic activity. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, a volcanic system of extraordinary scale that erupted as the supercontinent of Pangaea began, at last, its long and slow process of breaking apart, the rifting of the land producing the volcanic activity. The way rifting always produces volcanic activity, through the release of pressure in the underlying mantle as the crust above it separates along the lines of its own inherent weaknesses. The breakup of Pangaea changed everything, not immediately, and not in a way that any single generation of animals living through the earliest Jurassic would have experienced as dramatic change. But across the millions of years that followed, as the land masses that had been pressed together for so long began their slow and patient drift toward the positions we recognize from modern geography, the world's climate shifted in ways that would, over time, transform the sparse and recovering Triassic landscape into something that no living human eye has ever seen. And that requires a deliberate act of imagination to fully picture. Wetter, warmer, greener in a way that the Triassic world, with its wide red floodplains and its sparse pioneering vegetation, had never quite managed to be. A greenness arising from the combination of a warmer global climate, a more humid atmosphere generated by the increasing coastline that the fragmenting landmasses were producing, and the recovery and expansion of the plant communities that the end Triassic extinction had disrupted but not destroyed. And into this warmer, wetter, more productive world, the dinosaurs, freed now from competition with the groups that had been sharing the Triassic ecological space with them, expanded in the way that life always expands when the conditions are right and the space is available, not through any deliberate strategy or conscious ambition, but through the simple and patient arithmetic of animals, better suited to the available conditions, leaving more offspring than the animals less suited to them. The dinosaurs diversified across the Jurassic in a radiation of body plans and ecological roles and behavioral strategies that would, by the end of the period, have populated every major terrestrial ecological niche on the planet, with some member of the dinosaur family tree. The Jurassic world, at its height, was one of the most extraordinary ecosystems this planet has ever hosted. To stand within it, to stand, if such a thing were possible, in the late afternoon of a middle Jurassic day in what is now the Morrison Formation of the western United States, or in the fossil-rich deposits of the Tendaguru Formation of Tanzania, or in any of the other great Jurassic fossil sites, distributed across the continents that were, in this period, still in the early stages of their slow separation from one another, would be to stand in a world operating at a scale that the modern world, for all its own extraordinary biological richness, simply does not match. The trees were tall. The conifers that had been present in the Triassic as relatively modest trees had, across the millions of years of the Jurassic, grown into something far more imposing. Tall, straight, dense-crowned forests of Araucarian conifers stretching across the floodplains and the upland areas of the Jurassic landscape in darkened resinous stands, their trunks rising to heights that the modern relatives of these ancient trees can still, in the forests of South America and the Pacific, occasionally approach, though the Jurassic forests covered vastly more of the available land surface than their modern descendants. Beneath these tall conifers, the understory was rich with ferns and horsetails and cycads. The cycads particularly, those extraordinary plants with their palm-like crowns and their ancient reproductive strategies, present in the Jurassic in far greater diversity and abundance than the small number of cycad species that survive into the present day, occupying the middle layer of the Jurassic forest, the way the broad-leaved shrubs and small trees of a modern forest occupy that middle layer, filtering the light that passed through the conifer canopy above into the particular quality of green-tinged shade that the forest floor below would have received. The forest floor itself was carpeted in mosses and ferns, the soft and deeply green surface of a world that received enough rainfall to keep its ground vegetation permanently moist, permanently growing, permanently contributing to the deep organic layer of soil that a mature Jurassic forest would have accumulated across the centuries of its slow development. It smelled of resin and wet earth, and the particular organic richness of a forest floor in full biological activity. Not the complex floral sweetness of a modern forest with its flowering plants and its insect pollinators and its extraordinary diversity of aromatic chemicals, because the flowering plants had not yet appeared, and the Jurassic world was still, in this respect, a world of simpler and more ancient smells, but rich and green, and alive in the full and completely functional sense of a biosphere that has found its equilibrium and is operating within it with the quiet confidence of something that has been working this way for a very long time. And through this forest, and across the floodplains beyond it, and along the river systems that wound through the Jurassic landscape in their broad and patient courses, moved the dinosaurs, many dinosaurs, more kinds of dinosaur, occupying more ecological roles, in more diverse forms than the Triassic world had ever seen. And among all of them, the ones that command the most attention, the ones that represent the most extraordinary experiment in the possibilities of vertebrate life on land, are the ones we need to rest with longest tonight. The sauropods. The long-necked, long-tailed, enormous-bodied herbivores that represent, in the opinion of most paleontologists who have spent significant time thinking about the full range of body plans that evolution has ever produced, one of the most extreme and one of the most successful experiments in the history of land animals. Animals so large and so numerous and so perfectly suited to the conditions of the Jurassic world that the Jurassic is, in a very real sense, their age even more than it is the age of any other group of animals that shared it with them. To understand what a sauropod was, it helps to begin not with their size, though their size is extraordinary, and we will spend considerable time with it, but with the particular combination of features that made their size possible, because size alone, in a land animal, creates problems that require very specific solutions, and the sauropods solve those problems in ways that no other group of large land animals has ever quite replicated. Their bones were hollow, not hollow in the way that a bamboo cane is hollow, simply a tube of structural material surrounding an empty space, but hollow in the complex and specifically biological way of bones that have been invaded by the air sac system, connected to the respiratory apparatus, extensions of the lungs' air storage capacity, reaching into the vertebrae and the long bones of the limbs, creating a pneumatized skeletal structure that was simultaneously lighter than solid bone and, because of the particular geometry of its internal struts and walls, structurally stronger than solid bone of the same weight would have been. This pneumatization, shared in a modified form with the modern birds that are the dinosaurs' living descendants, meant that an animal the size of a brachiosaurus, an animal whose mass has been estimated at somewhere between 30 and 60 tons, depending on the assumptions made about its soft tissue distribution, an animal whose height approached 6 meters and whose total length approached 26 meters, was carrying far less bone weight per unit of body size than the solid-boned mammals that would eventually, in the Cenozoic, produce their own experiments in large body size, and never quite reach the dimensions that the pneumatized sauropod skeleton made possible. Their necks were extraordinary. The neck of a Mamenchisaurus, one of the longest-necked sauropods known from the late Jurassic of China, contained vertebrae that were themselves longer than the entire bodies of some of the smaller dinosaurs sharing the same landscape, and the total neck length of this single animal reached perhaps 15 meters, longer than the entire body of most large land animals alive today, extended forward and upward from a body that was itself already enormous by any standard other than comparison with other sauropods. What the neck was for, whether the sauropods used it primarily to feed from the high branches of the tall conifers around them, browsing the canopy the way a giraffe browses the high branches of acacia trees today, or whether they swept it low and wide across the ground vegetation, cropping the ferns and horsetails of the forest floor and the floodplain in wide lateral arcs without needing to move their enormous bodies between feeding bouts, is a question that paleontologists are still working through with the careful, patient attention it deserves. And the answer is probably different for different sauropod species, because the diversity of neck lengths and neck orientations across the sauropod family tree suggests that different lineages were exploiting different feeding niches within the same broad ecological category of very large herbivore. But whatever the neck was doing, and whatever the precise details of the feeding behavior that 4 metric tons of neck bone and muscle was evolved to support, the effect of a sauropod herd moving through a Jurassic landscape was one of the most visually extraordinary things that this planet has ever hosted, and resting within the image of it for a while, holding it in the quieter regions of the mind, allowing the scale of it to do what scale always does when the mind encounters something truly beyond its ordinary frame of reference, is one of the most reliable paths to the particular softening of conscious thought that precedes sleep. Picture a floodplain, wide and flat and crossed by the broad braided channels of a river system in its middle course, the water moving slowly between shallow banks of pale, fine-grained sediment that the river has been depositing here across the centuries of its slow meander. Across this landscape, the banks dotted with the dense growth of horsetails and ferns that a permanently moist riparian environment sustains. The tall conifers beginning where the ground rises above the floodline and running back, in their dense and resinous stands, toward the upland areas where the drainage is better and the soil deeper. Now place within this landscape a herd of sauropods, not one or two, not the isolated individuals that the popular imagination tends to picture moving through a Jurassic landscape in splendid solitude, but a herd, the kind of grouping that the trackway evidence, those remarkable preserved sequences of sauropod footprints found in formations around the world, suggests was the normal social arrangement of at least some sauropod species. The animals moving together across the landscape in the way that the large herbivores of the African savanna move together today, the smaller individuals moving in the center of the group and the larger individuals ranged around the outside, the whole herd covering ground at a pace that, for an animal with legs several meters long, represents something closer to a slow and unhurried stroll than a purposeful march. Each footfall of a large sauropod left a circular impression in the soft floodplain sediment, approximately a meter across, and perhaps 30 or 40 centimeters deep, the weight of 30 or 40 tons, pressing down through a footpad that was broad and cushioned, like the foot of an elephant enlarged to the scale demanded by a body many times an elephant's size. And these impressions filled slowly with water as the herd moved on, creating a trail of temporary pools that would, in the days and weeks following the herd's passage, attract the smaller animals of the Jurassic landscape to drink and forage in the disturbed and temporarily enriched zone of soil and broken vegetation that a moving sauropod herd left in its wake. The sound of such a herd passing across a Jurassic floodplain would have been something felt as much as heard: the deep, low vibration of enormous bodies moving through waterlogged sediment, transmitted through the ground and into the feet and legs and bodies of anything standing nearby, below the threshold of ordinary hearing, but present in the way that the passage of very large things is always present, as a physical disturbance in the medium that surrounds you, rather than simply as a sound arriving at your ears. And the sauropods themselves may have communicated in frequencies as deep as those ground vibrations. The evidence for sauropod vocalization is indirect, as it must be for any behavior that leaves no direct trace in the fossil record, but the inference from the anatomy of their respiratory systems and the analogy with large living animals that use low-frequency sound for long-distance communication across open landscapes suggests that a sauropod herd was, in the frequency ranges below human hearing, a communicating community its members in contact with one another across distances that the Jurassic landscape allowed low-frequency sound to travel without the interference that higher frequency calls encounter in dense vegetation. The Jurassic night settled over this landscape in the long and gradual way of nights in a world without artificial light to smooth the transition. The sky above the tall conifers moving from the blue of afternoon to the deep, saturated blue of dusk, the first stars appearing in the east before the western horizon had fully released its last warmth of color, the air cooling from the particular warm dampness of a humid Jurassic afternoon into the softer coolness of a Jurassic night that was, in this period of Earth history, warmer than the nights we know in most parts of the world today. The polar ice caps largely absent in the Jurassic climate, the warmth distributed more evenly from equator to pole than our own cooler era allows. The sauropods did not stop as the light faded. Animals of their size, with metabolic needs of the scale that their body mass demanded, could not afford to stop, simply because the light had changed. They continued moving through the Jurassic night, their long necks still sweeping through the vegetation, their enormous feet still pressing their circular impressions into the soft ground, the herd maintaining its loose and ambling cohesion through whatever combination of low-frequency sound and physical proximity, and the particular social bonds that decades of shared movement through, the same landscapes must have produced. And in the trees around them, and in the undergrowth between them, and in the dark water of the river channels beside them, the rest of the Jurassic world was conducting its own nocturnal business. The small mammals that had been hiding from the heat and the visual predators of the Jurassic day, emerging into the cooler, dark to forage through the leaf litter, the early theropods whose scaleral ring anatomy suggests a crepuscular or nocturnal lifestyle, becoming more active as the light that the diurnal hunters depended upon faded, the insects rising in their evening columns above the still water of the floodplain pools. The Jurassic night, in its full biological complexity, was not a quiet night by the standards of the Triassic recovery world we rested in at the close of our last chapter. It was a full and functioning biosphere conducting its nocturnal half at the same time that its diurnal half was resting. A world that never entirely stopped, simply shifted its activity from one community of organisms to another, as the slow rotation of the planet carried this particular piece of Jurassic landscape through its daily cycle. But it was slower than the Jurassic day, and cooler, and the darkness between the tall conifers had a particular quality of depth, the resinous smell of the trees intensifying slightly in the cooler air, the way that smells intensify when the warmth that was dispersing them retreats and the air becomes still enough for the chemical signals of the living world to linger rather than drift away. That gives the imagined Jurassic night a quality of enclosed and ancient richness, very different from the open and sparse quality of the Triassic evening we left behind. Somewhere in that darkness, the enormous shapes of the resting sauropods were visible against the slightly less dark sky, their long necks lowered in whatever posture the largest land animals that have ever lived adopted when the demands of their bodies allowed them, briefly, to rest. The evidence for sauropod rest behavior is, like most behavioral evidence from deep time, indirect and incomplete. But the bone histology and the analogy with large living animals suggests that at least some of them lay down for short periods during the darkest hours, their enormous bodies pressing into the soft sediment of the floodplain and leaving impressions that, in some remarkable fossil sites, have been preserved and found and studied by researchers who recognized, in the particular size and shape of the depressions in the ancient rock, the outline of an animal resting in the dark of a night 200 million years ago. An animal resting in the dark 200 million years ago, in a night that was, in all the ways that matter to a body seeking rest, not so entirely different from this one, dark and cooler than the day, and full of the slow sounds of a living world conducting its quiet nocturnal business in the space between one dawn and the next. Rest here for a while, in the Jurassic dark, with the enormous and unhurried shapes of the greatest land animals this planet has ever produced, resting somewhere nearby in the soft sediment of the floodplain. The tall conifers are very still. The river is moving slowly in its broad and braided channel somewhere in the middle distance. And the night above the Jurassic world is very full of stars, the same stars in slightly different positions that are above you tonight, looking down on a world that has changed almost beyond recognition since this particular night, and yet still carrying, in the darkness between them, the same patient and entirely indifferent quality of deep space that they have always carried, whether the world below them was this one, or the Jurassic, or any of the countless other configurations this planet has moved through in its long and still continuing life. The sauropods are resting, the Jurassic night is very warm, and the age of giants, in its own quiet and unhurried way, is exactly as old as it has always been, and exactly as present in the patient record of the rock as it will always remain. We have been traveling through the Mesozoic world for 3 chapters now, moving through deep time with the patient and unhurried ease of a mind that has already released most of its hold on the particular evening we began from, and what we have seen, the sparse and recovering Triassic landscape, the first small dinosaurs moving through its undergrowth, with the modest confidence of animals that do not yet know what they are becoming, the extraordinary richness of the Jurassic world, with its tall conifer forests and its enormous sauropod herds, moving through the warm dark of a night 200 million years ago, has been, in a very real sense, a reconstruction, a careful, scientifically grounded, and in many of its details remarkably well-supported reconstruction, but a reconstruction nonetheless, built from the evidence that the Mesozoic world left behind in the rock, assembled by generations of patient and methodical researchers who spent their careers asking very specific questions of very old stone and learning, slowly, and with the particular satisfaction of scientific work done carefully, what the stone was willing to tell them. And tonight, in this chapter, we are going to step back from the world we have been walking through and spend some time with the science itself, with the tools and the methods and the specific, remarkable discoveries that have allowed us to know what we know about animals that have not been alive for 66 million years, and that have allowed us, in some cases, to know things about those animals that are intimate and specific and deeply personal, in ways that the very age of the subject makes almost impossible to fully absorb. Because the science of paleontology, at its best, is not simply the science of identifying and naming extinct animals from the shapes of their preserved bones. It is the science of reconstructing lives, and the tools that the field has developed for doing this work, particularly in the last several decades, as new technologies have become available and new questions have been formulated with the precision those technologies allow, have produced a picture of the dinosaurs that is, in almost every respect, richer and stranger and more detailed than anyone working in the early 20th century would have thought possible. We begin with the bones themselves. A dinosaur bone preserved in rock is not simply a record of shape, not simply the outline of a femur or a vertebra or a skull bone that tells us the animal was this large and arranged its skeleton in this particular way, though those shapes carry an enormous amount of information on their own and have been the primary subject of paleontological study since the first dinosaur bones were recognized as something new and extraordinary in the early 19th century. A dinosaur bone, examined in cross-section under a microscope, is also a record of time, The process is called bone histology, from the Greek word for tissue, and it involves cutting a thin slice from a preserved dinosaur bone and examining the internal structure of that slice under magnification. Reading the layers of bone tissue the way a dendrochronologist reads the growth rings of a tree, because bone, like wood, lays down its growth in annual layers, and those layers, preserved with extraordinary fidelity in the mineral matrix that replaces the original organic material during the fossilization process, remain readable in fossilized bone that is hundreds of millions of years old. Each growth ring in a dinosaur bone represents 1 year of the animal's life. Not approximately 1 year, not a rough estimate or a broad inference. 1 year, the same way a tree ring represents 1 year. The same counting principle applied to a different biological material in a different taxonomic group. The underlying mechanism of seasonal growth producing the same readable record in the bone of a Cretaceous theropod that it produces in the wood of a living oak. Wide, open-textured rings indicate years of rapid growth, years when the animal was young and still in the exponential phase of its development, adding mass and height at the extraordinary rate that the bone record of many dinosaur species reveals, a rate that exceeded, in some cases significantly, the growth rates of any living reptile and approached or matched the growth rates of the fastest-growing large mammals alive today. Narrower, denser rings indicate years of slower growth, years when the animal was older, approaching its adult size, the growth rate tapering off as the developmental program that had been driving such rapid early increase began, in its own slow and internally regulated way, to wind down. And in some individuals, a series of rings so closely spaced they can barely be distinguished from one another marks the point at which the animal reached its full adult size and essentially stopped growing, the bone laying down only the minimum annual increment of maintenance and repair, rather than the generous annual increment of genuine size increase. From these rings, read carefully by researchers with the patience and the training to extract their full information, it is possible to determine not only how old a particular individual was when it died, but how fast it was growing at the time of its death, whether it had reached sexual maturity, whether it was still in the rapid growth phase of early development, or the slower maintenance phase of full adulthood, and in some cases, whether the stress of particular years, years of drought, or disease, or food scarcity, left their mark in the form of lines of arrested growth, thin dark bands in the bone record where growth slowed or stopped entirely for a period before resuming. A researcher named Christina Curry-Rogers spent years studying the bone histology of titanosaur sauropods, the great long-necked herbivores that we spent time with in our previous chapter, and what the growth rings in their bones revealed about the pace and pattern of their development was, in the context of what had previously been assumed about large dinosaur growth, genuinely remarkable. The titanosaurs grew fast, extraordinarily fast, by the standards of any living reptile, and comparable, in the pace of their early development, to the fastest-growing large mammals known, which means that the image of sauropods as slow-growing, cold-blooded, metabolically sluggish animals that spent decades accumulating their extraordinary bulk at the measured pace of a modern large reptile was not simply incomplete but fundamentally wrong, replaced by the evidence of the bone rings, with the picture of animals whose early growth was rapid and sustained in a way that required a metabolic investment far beyond what any cold-blooded animal has ever managed. This is one thread of a much larger revolution in our understanding of dinosaur biology that has been building across the last several decades, woven from the histology evidence and from isotopic analyses of preserved bone and tooth material, and from detailed anatomical comparisons with the living birds that are the dinosaurs' direct descendants. all of it pointing in the same direction and producing a picture of the dinosaur's physiology that represents one of the most significant revisions in the history of paleontology. The dinosaurs were not cold-blooded in the way that modern reptiles are cold-blooded. This does not necessarily mean that they were warm-blooded in exactly the way that modern mammals and birds are warm-blooded, generating and maintaining a precise and constant internal body temperature entirely through internal metabolic heat production, regardless of external conditions. The evidence suggests a more complex and varied picture than that simple substitution would imply, with different dinosaur groups occupying different positions along the spectrum between the fully ectothermic metabolism of a modern lizard and the fully endothermic metabolism of a modern mammal. But the evidence from bone histology, from the isotopic analyses of growth patterns and body temperature proxies preserved in fossil material, and from the anatomical evidence of respiratory systems and cardiovascular structures that birds have inherited from their dinosaur ancestors, all converges on a picture of dinosaurs as animals operating at metabolic rates significantly higher than those of modern reptiles of comparable size. Animals capable of the sustained activity levels that rapid growth requires, of the parental investment that the nesting evidence records, and of the complex social behaviors that the trackway evidence suggests, in a way that a fully cold-blooded animal of the same size and in the same environmental conditions simply could not have managed. The nesting evidence deserves its own moment of quiet attention. In the Badlands of Montana, in the same Morrison Formation deposits where some of the great Jurassic dinosaur discoveries were made, a paleontologist named Jack Horner began finding, in the 1970s, something that no one had previously recognized in the dinosaur fossil record: nesting sites, preserved with a fidelity and a completeness that allowed not just the identification of the eggs, but the reconstruction of the nesting behavior of the animals that had laid them. The nests belonged to a hadrosaur, a duck-billed dinosaur of the Cretaceous period, that Horner named Maiasaura, a name meaning good mother lizard, chosen in recognition of what the nesting evidence revealed about the parental behavior of this particular animal, because what the nests showed was not the simple laying and abandoning of eggs that the cold-blooded reptile model of dinosaur reproduction had previously suggested was the most likely scenario. The nests were constructed, not simply holes scraped in the ground, not the minimal investment of a sea turtle depositing its eggs in the sand and returning to the water, but carefully arranged bowl-shaped depressions in the sediment, lined with vegetation, arranged in a colonial nesting ground in which the individual nests were spaced approximately the body length of an adult Maiasaura apart, close enough for the adults to move easily between them, without stepping on their neighbors' nests, far enough to maintain the spatial integrity of each nest as a separate site. And the bones of the hatchlings found in the nests told a story that the nest construction alone had already begun to suggest. The bones of the young animals showed that they were not fully developed. At hatching, that their leg joints were not ossified to the degree that would have been necessary for independent movement, which meant that the hatchlings were, in the first weeks and possibly months of their lives, dependent on the adults for food and protection in a way that required the adults to remain at or near the nest, rather than departing after the eggs were laid. The name Horner chose, Good Mother Lizard, was not simply poetic, it was paleontologically precise, grounded in the specific and measurable evidence of nest construction and hatchling bone development that the Montana Badlands had preserved across 75 million years of geological time, and it represented, in the context of the dominant assumptions about dinosaur behavior that had prevailed through most of the 20th century, a genuinely revolutionary reframing of what these animals had been. They were parents, not in the way that the word parent implies in the context of our own experience, not with the full complexity of mammalian parental investment, but in the real and biologically meaningful sense of animals that constructed sites for their offspring, remained present at those sites through the period when their offspring required protection and nourishment, and almost certainly provisioned their young with food during the period when the young were not yet mobile enough to forage for themselves. The modern birds that are the dinosaurs' descendants express this parental investment in the extraordinarily elaborate nest-building and chick-rearing behaviors that ornithologists have been studying and documenting for centuries, and the continuity between what the Maiasaura nesting sites record and what a robin or a hawk or an albatross does for its offspring today is one of the most quietly moving threads of continuity in the entire story of the dinosaurs. An unbroken behavioral inheritance passing from the Cretaceous badlands of Montana to the nest outside your window through 66 million years of evolutionary change that altered the form, but not, apparently, the fundamental commitment. Let us turn now to the trace fossils, the other great source of behavioral evidence that the Mesozoic world has left behind, in some ways even more directly informative about the daily lives of living animals than the bones themselves. A trace fossil is not the preserved remains of an organism's, but the preserved record of something an organism did, a footprint pressed into soft sediment and then buried before it could be disturbed, a burrow whose walls were hardened by the mineral-rich water percolating through the sediment around them, a preserved nest, a coprolite carrying the chemical signatures of a long-vanished meal, the tooth marks of a predator preserved in the bone of its prey. Footprints, in particular, have proven to be extraordinarily informative, and the record of dinosaur trackways preserved in rock formations around the world is extensive enough and varied enough that entire careers have been devoted to their study, extracting from the spacing and depth and individual shape of each preserved impression a level of detail about the living animal that the bones alone could never provide. The spacing between footprints tells us the stride length, and from the stride length and the estimated hip height of the animal that made the track, it is possible to calculate the speed at which the animal was moving. Not exactly, because the relationship between stride length and speed involves assumptions about limb proportions and gait mechanics that the tracks themselves do not directly record, but within a range of reasonable estimates that tells us whether the animal was walking, or moving at a brisk trot, or running in the full and committed sense of an animal covering ground as fast as its legs can carry it. A set of theropod tracks from the early Cretaceous of Texas, studied by researchers who spent considerable time with the particular mathematics of stride length and hip height, suggested an animal moving at a speed somewhere between 12 and 15 kilometers per hour, not sprinting, not the dramatic full-speed pursuit of a large prey animal, but a sustained trot of the kind that covers ground efficiently over a long distance, the kind of movement associated not with the climactic moments of a hunt, but with the ordinary, unhurried business of an animal moving through its landscape in the course of a normal day. Another trackway from the Morrison Formation of Colorado tells a different story. A single long line of sauropod tracks moving in a consistent direction across a Jurassic floodplain, and beside it, overlapping with it in places, the tracks of a smaller sauropod moving in the same direction, at the same pace, for an extended distance before the two trackways finally separate and go their own ways. Two animals moving together across a Jurassic floodplain, one larger, one smaller. The tracks of the smaller animal, in several places where the two trackways come close together, show a slight adjustment of direction toward the larger animal, a subtle shift in the line of travel that suggests the smaller animal was orienting to the larger one, maintaining proximity in the way that a young animal maintains proximity to an older one when moving through an unfamiliar or potentially hazardous environment. The trackway does not prove a parent-offspring relationship. It cannot, because tracks do not carry the genetic or developmental information that would allow that relationship to be confirmed with the certainty that scientific claims require. But it suggests one, in the gentle and indirect way that behavioral evidence from deep time always suggests rather than proves, and the suggestion is powerful enough and consistent enough with the other evidence for sauropod social behavior that the nesting sites and the bone histology and the body proportion studies have produced, that it sits comfortably in the mind as something that very probably represents exactly what it looks like. Two related animals, moving through the Jurassic world together, the smaller one keeping close to the larger one, in the ancient and practical way of the young keeping close to those who know the landscape better than they do. And now we arrive at the most intimate piece of evidence that bone histology has produced, the piece of evidence that requires the longest pause and the most careful attention and the most deliberate willingness to sit with what it implies across the distance of 66 million years. When a dinosaur bone is sectioned and the growth rings are counted and the story of an individual life is read from the widths and textures of those annual increments, it is sometimes possible to determine not just how old the animal was when it died, but something about the circumstances of its death, whether it was fully grown, whether it was still in the rapid growth phase of early development, whether the last ring laid down before death was wide and well-nourished or narrow and stressed, in the way that difficult conditions always leave their mark in biological growth records. A researcher sectioning the leg bone of a Tyrannosaurus rex specimen, designated as B. rex, a specimen that had been collected from the Hell Creek Formation of Montana, and that subsequent analysis would reveal to be one of the most scientifically informative individual dinosaur specimens ever found growth rings, indicating that this individual was approximately 18 years old at the time of its death, still in the rapid growth phase of early development, far from the maximum size that a fully adult Tyrannosaurus could achieve, and carrying within its bone tissue the preserved remains of medullary bone, a type of bone tissue produced by female birds during the egg-laying season as a calcium reserve for eggshell formation. 18 years old, still growing, female, probably in the process of reproducing for the first time, or one of the first times, when whatever ended her life in the late Cretaceous of what is now Montana brought that particular story to its close. She had been alive for 18 years in a world so different from ours that the familiar continents had not yet fully assumed their modern configurations, breathing air that was slightly different in its composition from the air that fills this room tonight, moving through a landscape populated by animals whose like the world will not see again, conducting the ordinary and daily business of a large predator's life with no knowledge of the 66 million years that lay between her particular afternoon and this one. And then she was gone, and her bones lay in the sediment of the Hell Creek floodplain for 66 million years. Through the extinction of her species and the extinction of the world she had known, through the rise of the mammals and the slow cooling of the climate, and the long geological reshaping of the landscape above her, until a researcher knelt beside an eroding hillside in Montana and found the edge of a bone protruding from the rock, and began the careful work of bringing what was left of that particular life back into the light. The bone histology that followed told us she was 18, still growing, and the detail of it The intimacy of knowing the age of an individual animal that lived 66 million years ago, of reading in the rings of her preserved bone, not just the fact of her existence, but the specific chapter of her life that she had reached when it ended, is one of the most quietly extraordinary things that the science of paleontology has produced, a reaching across time so complete and so specific that it briefly collapses the distance between this moment and the Cretaceous into something very small, something almost intimate, something that the mind, in its quiet and receptive evening state, can hold without effort and without any need to do anything further with it, except simply feel what it is. 66 million years, 18 years old, still growing. Rest in that for a while, in the quiet of this long and unhurried night, before we move forward into the next chapter of the story, into the chapter devoted entirely to the creatures that the Jurassic sauropods became in the fullness of their development, the specific and extraordinary details of how the largest land animals that have ever lived spent their days and their nights in the warm and ancient world that sustained them for so extraordinarily long. The science is very patient, the bones are very old, and the distance between that Cretaceous afternoon and this one is, in the context of everything we have been traveling through together tonight, not quite as large as it seemed when we first set out. There is a particular quality of stillness that settles over a landscape when something very large is resting within it. Not the stillness of an empty landscape, not the uncomplicated quiet of a place where nothing is present, but a different kind of stillness. A stillness with weight and warmth and the slow, barely perceptible rhythm of enormous breathing at its center. The way the air in a room changes when someone very large and very calm is sleeping in it. The whole atmosphere of the space organized, almost imperceptibly, around the fact of that large and unhurried presence. This is the stillness we are going to rest in tonight. The stillness of a Jurassic floodplain in the last hours before dawn, with the tall conifers standing dark and motionless against a sky, beginning its first and most tentative shift from deep night black toward the particular deep blue that precedes the actual arrival of any light worth calling light, and somewhere on the soft sediment of the plain, shapes so large that the eye, encountering them in the pre-dawn dark, takes a moment to resolve them into animals rather than simply accepting them as features of the landscape itself. The sauropods are resting, and we are going to spend this chapter simply with them, not moving through their world at the pace we have been traveling through the larger story of the Mesozoic, but pausing and settling and allowing the full and extraordinary reality of what these animals were to be received slowly, at the pace these animals themselves seemed to set for everything that happened in their proximity. The sauropods are, by almost any measure you might choose to apply, the most extreme experiment in the possibilities of vertebrate life on land that this planet has ever conducted. They were not simply large in the way that large animals are large. They were large in a way that required the invention of entirely new biological solutions to problems that no previous land animal had encountered in quite the same form, and the elegance and the completeness of those solutions, when examined in the detail that the fossil record and the comparative anatomy of their living descendants now allows, is one of the most quietly astonishing things that the science of paleontology has to offer to anyone willing to sit with it long enough to let its full dimensions become apparent. Begin with the neck. We discussed the neck briefly in our chapter on the Jurassic world, noting its extraordinary length and the range of feeding strategies that different sauropod species appear to have employed. But the neck deserves more time than a brief introduction allows, because the neck of a sauropod is not simply a long neck in the way that the neck of a giraffe is a long neck. It is a structural achievement of a completely different order, a biological engineering solution to a set of competing demands that the laws of physics imposed on any animal attempting to be simultaneously very large and very mobile in a world where food was distributed across a wide vertical range from the forest floor to the upper canopy. The vertebrae of the sauropod neck, the individual bones that, stacked in sequence and connected by the ligaments and muscles that held the entire structure in its long and sweeping arc, were themselves pneumatized in the same way that the vertebrae of the trunk were pneumatized, invaded by the extensions of the air sac system that made the entire skeleton lighter than solid bone of the same dimensions, would have been. And this pneumatization was not uniform throughout the bone, but concentrated in precisely the places where the structural loads were lowest, leaving the material of the bone exactly where the mechanical analysis of stress and strain required it to be, and removing it precisely where it was not needed. The result was a vertebra that was simultaneously lighter than it looked and stronger than it appeared. A structure that the engineers who have studied it in detail, bringing the tools of material science and structural mechanics to the interpretation of 150-million-year-old bone, have found to be, in certain specific respects, more efficiently designed for its particular combination of loading conditions than any human-engineered structural element of comparable weight and span. Nature, given enough time and enough generations of selection pressure, finds solutions that deliberate engineering sometimes takes centuries to approach. The muscles that moved this neck were anchored to the vertebrae and to the bones of the shoulder girdle in arrangements that allowed the neck to be moved slowly and continuously through wide arcs, without requiring the sustained muscular effort that would have been necessary if the neck had been held in a fixed position and then moved by discrete contractions. Instead, the ligaments running along the top of the neck, elastic and strong, stored and released energy, with each movement the way a bow stores and releases energy, so that the metabolic cost of moving a 15-meter neck from one feeding position to the next was, by the standards of an animal of this size, surprisingly modest. The neck moved, in other words, the way everything about the sauropods moved, with a kind of built-in economy, a biological efficiency that made the extraordinary possible by ensuring that the extraordinary did not cost more than the animal could afford to pay. Allow your breathing to slow here, in the pre-dawn stillness of the Jurassic floodplain, and simply hold, in the receptive quiet of a mind that is no longer asking much of itself, the image of a brachiosaurus neck moving through the early morning air. Not quickly, never quickly. The neck of a large sauropod swinging slowly from one feeding position to the next, covering a distance of several meters in the time that a human arm might cover a few centimeters, moving with the measured and entirely unhurried pace of something operating on a timescale determined not by urgency, but by the patient logic of an enormous body's relationship with the world it moves through. The head at the end of this neck, small relative to the body, almost absurdly small when the eye travels from the vast barrel of the trunk along the entire sweeping length of the neck and arrives, finally, at the relatively modest structure of bone and muscle and sensory organs that constituted the sauropod's interface with the immediate details of its world, was equipped with teeth suited precisely to the feeding strategy of the particular species it belonged to. In the diplodocid sauropods, the long, low-slung sauropods like Diplodocus and Apatosaurus, whose necks were held more horizontally than the vertical neck posture of the brachiosaurs, and whose total length could exceed 25 meters. The teeth were narrow, peg-like, and arranged only in the front of the jaw, designed not for chewing, but for the simple and efficient stripping of leaves and needles from the branches that the neck brought within reach. the vegetation stripped free with a single raking motion and swallowed whole, to be processed further along in the digestive system. The digestive system of a large sauropod was, by any reasonable estimation, an extraordinary chemical and mechanical processing facility contained within the vast space of the abdominal cavity. Vast quantities of relatively low-quality vegetation, swallowed without the benefit of any oral processing, needed to be broken down into the nutrients that a body of this size required, and the sauropods accomplished this through a combination of the gastroliths we mentioned briefly in the chapter on the Jurassic world. Smooth stones, deliberately swallowed and retained in a muscular stomach, grinding the plant material mechanically, and the long, slow chemical processing of a digestive system that, in an animal of this size and with this volume of material to process, must have been operating continuously and at full capacity through every hour of every day and much of every night. The gastroliths themselves have been found in association with sauropod skeletal material in several fossil sites. Smooth, rounded stones, clearly transported from their geological source by some deliberate means, found in the abdominal region of articulated sauropod skeletons in positions that could only make sense if the stones had been inside the body at the time of death and burial, retained in the stomach for the mechanical role they were serving, rather than being accidentally ingested with the vegetation. Some of the sauropods that have been found with gastroliths in situ show evidence of having carried remarkably large accumulations of these stones. Masses of smooth pebbles and cobbles representing a significant investment of time and effort in their collection, maintained throughout the animal's life and replaced as they wore smooth and lost their grinding efficiency. A piece of deliberate behavior in the strict sense that it represents an action taken to address a specific physiological need, maintained consistently across the lifetime of the individual. The scale of food intake that sustained a large sauropod has been estimated in various ways by researchers approaching the question from the energetic side, calculating the metabolic rate of an animal of this mass, and then working out what volume of vegetation, with the known caloric density of Jurassic plant material, would have been required to meet that metabolic demand. And the numbers that emerge from these calculations, while uncertain in their precise values, because the metabolic rate itself is not directly measurable in an extinct animal, consistently suggest that a large sauropod was feeding for a very significant portion of every day, moving through the Jurassic landscape in a continuous and unhurried process of vegetation consumption that covered considerable distances, simply in the process of accessing enough food to keep the extraordinary biological machinery of this body functioning. The trackway evidence is consistent with this picture. Long, continuous sauropod trackways moving across Jurassic floodplains in directions that suggest purposeful movement rather than random wandering. The stride lengths indicating a walking pace, maintained steadily across the distance that the preserved section of the trackway covers. Animals moving through their landscape with the quiet and continuous intention of animals that know, at some level of their biology, if not their consciousness, that their size requires them to keep moving. And the moving was, by the evidence of the trackways and the bone structure and the biomechanical analyses that have been applied to the locomotion of these animals, smooth and even and entirely unremarkable in the sense that the locomotion of very large and very well-adapted animals is always unremarkable, not labored, not effortful in any visible way, simply the steady and unhurried forward movement of a body designed, through millions of years of evolutionary refinement, to do exactly this as efficiently as it could be done. The sound of a sauropod walking across a Jurassic floodplain deserves its own quiet moment of attention. Each footfall of an adult Brachiosaurus or Diplodocus pressed a circular impression perhaps a meter across into the soft sediment of the floodplain. The weight of the animal, somewhere between 20 and 50 tons, depending on the species and the individual, distributed across a broad, cushioned footpad that spread the load and prevented the foot from sinking more than a few tens of centimeters into the soft ground, but still transmitting into the substrate beneath it a vibration that any sensitive instrument placed in the ground nearby would have recorded as a distinct seismic event. Not a dramatic seismic event, not an earthquake, not anything that the casual observer would have described as a tremor, but a low, felt rather than heard disturbance in the ground, a pulse of compression moving outward through the waterlogged sediment of the floodplain at the speed of sound through soft soil, arriving at the feet and legs of any animal within a radius of perhaps several hundred meters, and registering there as a faint but clear signal that something very large was moving somewhere nearby. The smaller animals of the Jurassic landscape read these ground vibrations the way any prey animal reads the signals of a potentially dangerous neighbor, not with the specific interpretive intelligence that a human observer would bring to the same signal, but with the ancient precognitive sensitivity to ground vibration that many animals express as a general alertness, a slight heightening of attention, a readiness to move that did not yet constitute movement, but could become movement very quickly if subsequent signals warranted it. For the sauropods themselves, moving in their loose and ambling herds across the floodplain, the ground vibrations of their own movement were simply the physical background of their daily existence, present as they had always been present. As unremarkable as the sound of your own footsteps is unremarkable to you, the body long since habituated to the specific signature of its own movement and filtering it out in the same automatic way that all sensory systems filter out the consistent and uninformative signals of normal self-generated activity. They may, however, have been sensitive to variations in those ground vibrations, to the particular frequency and amplitude signature of a herd moving versus a single animal, to the difference between the footfall pattern of an adult and a juvenile, to the approach of a very large theropod whose own footfalls, lighter per unit area than those of the sauropods, but still substantial, would have produced their own detectable ground signal at distances well beyond the visual range of an animal moving through the dense Jurassic undergrowth. The hypothesis that sauropods communicated through infrasound, through sound frequencies below the range of human hearing, produced by large bodies, moving and breathing and vocalizing in the low registers that very large animals naturally favor, is grounded in the straightforward observation that the largest living animals we know of use exactly this strategy for exactly the same reasons. To maintain contact across the large distances that large bodies, requiring large feeding ranges, inevitably introduce between the members of a social group. Elephants communicate through infrasound, produced by the vibration of the larynx, traveling both through the air at distances of several kilometers, and through the ground at distances that may be even greater, received by other elephants partly through their ears and partly through the sensitive tissues of their feet and lower legs in contact with the ground, a dual-channel communication system so effective that elephant herds separated by distances that would make visual or ordinary auditory contact impossible can nonetheless maintain a degree of behavioral coordination that requires the transmission of information between them. If the sauropods used a comparable system, and the size analogy and the pneumatized respiratory anatomy that their avian descendants have elaborated into the most efficient respiratory system of any Living vertebrate both suggest that they had the physical apparatus necessary for the production of low-frequency vocalizations. Then, the Jurassic landscape around a sauropod herd would have been, in the frequency ranges below human perception, a continuously communicating environment. The members of the herd exchanging signals about their location, their state, the presence of food or water or potential threat, in a slow and deep register that the world around them simply did not hear. A quiet conversation, conducted in frequencies too low for any other ear in the Jurassic world to intercept, passing between enormous bodies moving slowly through the warm and humid air of a Jurassic morning. The pre-dawn light is beginning now, in the east, above the tall conifers, not yet dawn, not yet the moment when the first direct sunlight will clear the horizon and begin the slow process of warming the Jurassic air toward the temperature of another long and productive Mesozoic day. But the first pale differentiation of the sky, the eastern horizon showing a shade lighter than the deep blue-black of the rest of the night sky, a difference visible only because the darkness around it provides the comparison. The sauropods that have been resting through the quietest hours of the night are beginning, some of them, to shift. Not dramatically, not in the sudden and fully committed way that a smaller, faster animal rises from rest, but gradually, the enormous body rearranging itself in the slow and deliberate sequence that physics requires of any animal whose mass is measured in tens of tons, each movement calculated in the implicit and entirely unconscious way of bodies that have always known exactly how much effort each movement costs and exactly how to distribute that effort most efficiently across the skeletal and muscular system. A diplodocus rising from a lying position would have pushed its forequarters up first, its long neck swinging forward and down to counterbalance the weight shift, the hindquarters following in a rolling, sequential movement that the bone structure and the joint geometry of the animal made possible, and that the soft sediment of the floodplain received without protest. The impressions of the resting animal preserved in the mud for however long the slow process of burial and lithification would take to convert them from temporary traces to permanent record. And once upright, once the enormous body had achieved the foursquare stability of an adult sauropod at rest on its feet, the head would turn, slowly, in the slow arc permitted by the cervical musculature, scanning the early morning landscape with eyes positioned on the sides of the skull, in the way of an animal for whom the detection of approaching predators was always a more pressing visual priority than the binocular depth perception that a forward-facing eye arrangement provides. What those eyes registered of the pre-dawn Jurassic floodplain is something we cannot know with any precision. The visual system of the sauropods is among the least preserved aspects of their biology, the soft tissues of the eye leaving only the most indirect traces in the fossil record. But the world they were scanning was, in the first light of a Jurassic dawn, a world of extraordinary richness and quietness, the flat expanse of the floodplain reflecting whatever pale light the eastern sky was beginning to offer, the tall conifers standing in their dark and vertical ranks along the higher ground, the river moving in its slow and braided channels somewhere nearby, and across the floodplain, the shapes of the other members of the herd, standing or beginning to move, the whole scene assembled in the particular quality of light that exists nowhere except in the first minutes before the sun clears the horizon and changes everything. Allow yourself to rest here now in this particular quality of light, in the pre-dawn stillness of a Jurassic floodplain where the largest land animals that have ever lived are beginning, slowly and unhurriedly, their day. The ground beneath your feet, if you were standing here, would still carry the warmth of the previous day in its deeper layers. the thermal mass of the Jurassic floodplain sediment, releasing its stored heat slowly through the night, and still, in these last pre-dawn minutes, slightly warmer than the air above it. The air would smell of resin and river water, and the particular organic richness of a landscape that has been productive and undisturbed for long enough that the biological processes of growth and decay and renewal have built up in the soil and the water and the air above both. A dense and complex chemical signature that a modern human nose would recognize simply as the smell of something very alive and very old. And the sauropods, moving now in the first suggestions of the approaching day, would be all but silent by the standards of any ear tuned to the ordinary frequency ranges of the audible world. Their footfalls felt more than heard, their vocalizations, if they made them, passing below the threshold of ordinary hearing, their breathing, for all its enormous volume, conducted through respiratory systems so efficient that the air moving in and out of those vast bodies produced almost no audible turbulence. Simply the gentle giants, moving through their morning in the warm and ancient air of a world that was, for them, simply home. Rest here for as long as the night allows, in the company of these extraordinary and entirely unhurried animals, before we move forward into the next chapter of our journey, into the world of the Cretaceous, where the forests will be different and the climate will have shifted, and the animals moving through the changed landscape will be different from the ones we have spent these last hours with, though carrying forward in their bones and their behaviors and the slow and patient logic of their lives the deep inheritance of everything the Jurassic built. The sauropods are still moving somewhere across the floodplain, slowly, in the first pale light, in the warm and ancient morning of the world. We have been spending our time, through the chapters that have brought us here, in the company of the dinosaurs themselves, following their evolutionary emergence through the recovering Triassic world, resting in the extraordinary scale of the Jurassic sauropods, sitting with the intimate and patient science that has allowed researchers to read the annual rings of individual lives from the cross-sections of 150-million-year-old bone. But tonight, in this chapter, we are going to allow our attention to widen, not away from the dinosaurs, but outward from them, into the full ecological world that surrounded them and sustained them and made the Mesozoic the particular kind of world it was. Because the dinosaurs did not exist in isolation from the other living things that shared their world any more than any animal exists in isolation from the plants and insects and microorganisms that constitute the biological fabric of the environment it inhabits. And the world that the dinosaurs moved through was, in its plants and its insects, and its atmospheric chemistry, and its particular quality of light and air and smell, as extraordinary as the animals themselves. Allow your body to grow a little heavier now, into whatever surface it rests on tonight. Allow the quiet of this late hour to settle a little more completely around you, the way the Mesozoic forest settled around the animals that moved through it, enveloping and green and entirely without urgency of any kind. The first thing to understand about the plant world of the Mesozoic is that it changed dramatically and in ways that transformed not just the appearance of the landscape, but the fundamental ecological relationships between the plants and the animals that depended on them. Across the span of the era, we have been traveling through together, so that the plant world of the late Cretaceous, the period we are moving toward in our journey, was as different from the plant world of the early Jurassic as the tropical rainforest of the modern Amazon is different from the boreal forest of modern Siberia. In the Triassic and the early Jurassic, the plant communities that covered the available land surface were built from the groups we have already met in passing. The conifers, the cycads, the ginkgos, the tree ferns, the horsetails, the seed ferns. A flora that was, by any honest assessment, green and productive and capable of sustaining the extraordinary diversity and biomass of the dinosaur fauna that moved through it. But that was, compared to what came later, relatively uniform in its visual and chemical character. There were no flowers in the early Mesozoic. No roses, no magnolias, no orchids, no grasses, no fruit-bearing trees of any kind, no nectar, no pollen produced for the purpose of attracting insects rather than simply being dispersed by wind. None of the extraordinary diversity of reproductive strategies that the angiosperms, the flowering plants, would eventually introduce into the living world, and that would, in the process of their introduction, transform not just the plant kingdom, but the insect fauna, and through the insect fauna, the ecological structure of every terrestrial environment on Earth. The first flowering plants appeared in the fossil record in the early Cretaceous, approximately 130 million years ago, and their appearance was, in geological terms, rapid, not instantaneous, not a single moment of transformation, but fast enough by the standards of the timescales we have been moving through that the botanist Charles Darwin, encountering the sudden appearance and explosive diversification of the angiosperms in the fossil record, long before the tools existed to properly date or contextualize what he was seeing, described it as an abominable mystery, a phrase that has stayed with the scientific literature on flowering plant evolution ever since, as an acknowledgement that some of the most important transitions in the history of life on Earth are also, in certain respects, the most difficult to fully explain. The earliest flowering plants were modest, small, inconspicuous, occupying the disturbed ground and the forest edges rather than the closed canopy of the established conifer forests. Their flowers, simple, and their ecological footprint limited in the way that the ecological footprint of any genuinely new biological innovation is limited in its early stages, before the full range of partnerships and dependencies that make a major new group truly powerful have had time to develop. But they were already doing something that no plant had done before in quite the same way, offering something to the insects around them that the conifers and the cycads and the ginkgos had never offered: nectar, and the particular visual and chemical signals that direct an insect toward nectar, in exchange for the transport of pollen from one flower to another, a trade of nutrition for reproductive service that was, in its basic logic, as elegant and as mutually beneficial as the mycorrhizal trade we explored in our forest documentary, and that would, across the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic periods that followed it, produce a diversification of both the flowering plants and their insect partners of extraordinary speed and scope. The bees appeared in the Cretaceous, their earliest known fossil representatives, already showing the particular physical adaptations. The branched body hairs that trap pollen, the modified hind legs that form the pollen baskets of modern bees, that reveal them as animals already deeply committed to the partnership with flowering plants that their descendants continue today, carrying out, on an ordinary afternoon in any garden anywhere on Earth, the same basic transaction that their Cretaceous ancestors were conducting in the forests of the early flowering plant radiation 100 million years ago. The butterflies and moths, whose caterpillars feed on the leaves of flowering plants, and whose adults drink the nectar of flowers, diversified alongside the angiosperms in the pattern of co-evolution. that is one of the most characteristic features of the flowering plant revolution. Each new plant lineage providing new resources for new insect lineages. Each new insect lineage providing new pollination services for new plant lineages. The two great groups ratcheting each other forward in a diversification so rapid and so mutually reinforcing that it produced, across the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic, the majority of the species alive on land today. But the insects of the Mesozoic were not only the pollinators and the herbivores of the new flowering plant communities. They were, across the full span of the era, an extraordinarily diverse fauna in their own right, occupying ecological roles that ranged from the decomposers, breaking down the fallen organic matter of the forest floor, to the predators hunting other insects through the canopy air to the parasites, whose intimate relationships with larger animals have left their traces in the most extraordinary of all the records the Mesozoic has preserved. Amber, the fossilized resin of ancient trees, produced by the conifers and other resin-bearing plants of the Mesozoic as a defensive and wound-healing response to damage, has preserved, in the extraordinary intimacy of a medium that captures three-dimensional structure with a fidelity that no other preservation process can match. A gallery of Mesozoic life so detailed and so complete in its individual specimens that the insects and spiders and other small organisms caught within it look, to the eye that encounters them in a museum case or a research collection, less like fossils than like living animals that have simply stopped moving. A spider preserved in Cretaceous amber, 90 million years old, shows the arrangement of its eyes and the structure of its spinnerets with a clarity that would allow a modern arachnologist to place it within a family, to recognize, in a creature that has not moved in 90 million years, the particular combination of features that links it to a group whose descendants are spinning their webs in the corners of rooms and between the stems of garden plants somewhere near you tonight. A fly preserved in amber from the same period shows compound eyes still carrying their geometric structure. Each individual facet of the multi-element eye preserved in its original position, the whole optical surface intact in a way that the ordinary processes of fossilization in rock would never have allowed, a level of detail so complete that the researchers who study such specimens can make inferences about the visual capabilities of this individual animal, that the animal's much younger relatives, alive and available for direct study, are only now beginning to have their own visual systems characterized with comparable precision. And occasionally, in the most remarkable amber specimens, the preserved insect is not alone. A piece of Burmese amber approximately 100 million years old, studied and described by researchers in recent years, contains a small feathered structure, a fragment of what appears to be a dinosaur tail, complete with the individual feathers still attached to the preserved skin, the whole delicate structure captured in the resin at a moment of contact that could only have lasted seconds before the resin hardened and the preservation became permanent. A feathered dinosaur tail, 100 million years old, preserved in the resin of a Cretaceous tree, with a fidelity so extraordinary that the individual feathers can be examined under magnification and their structure compared directly with the feathers of living birds, confirming in one small and improbable piece of amber what the bone record had already been suggesting for decades: that the dinosaurs and the birds are not simply related but continuous. The same lineage moving through time in the long and unbroken way that life has always moved through time, changing form but not changing kind. The Cretaceous world that produced this amber and the forests that produced the resin that became it, was a world already beginning to look, in certain respects, more familiar than the Jurassic world we spent our previous chapters in. The first flowering plants spreading along the disturbed ground and the forest edges, the first butterflies moving through the warm Cretaceous air, the first grasses beginning their own quiet revolution at the margins of the established plant communities. The whole trajectory of the living world already bending, in ways too slow for any individual organism to perceive, toward the configuration that the Cenozoic would eventually make explicit. But the dinosaurs were still there. Through all of it, through the appearance of the first flower, and the first bee, and the first butterfly, through the diversification of the angiosperms, and the transformation of the insect fauna that accompanied it, through the gradual shifting of the plant communities from the conifer-dominated forests of the Jurassic toward the more varied and more colorful and more chemically complex landscapes of the late Cretaceous, the dinosaurs were present, moving through a world that was changing around them in its plants and its insects and its atmospheric chemistry, while they themselves continued to diversify and adapt and fill the ecological space that the Mesozoic provided. The last dinosaurs, the non-avian dinosaurs, the ones that would not survive the asteroid, were living in a world that smelled of flowers, a world that carried, on the warm Cretaceous air, the first complex floral scents that any world had ever carried, the particular aromatic chemistry of the angiosperms, reaching the olfactory organs of animals that had evolved in a world without those smells, and that incorporated this new chemical information into their understanding of their environment in whatever way their sensory systems allowed. We do not know what a triceratops made of a flowering plant. We do not know whether the flowers of the late Cretaceous were visually salient to the dinosaurs that moved past them, or whether they were simply part of the undifferentiated visual field of a landscape too large and too various for any single element to demand specific attention, or whether their scent carried any particular meaning to the animals that breathed it. What we know is only that the flowers were there, and the dinosaurs were there, and they shared the same Cretaceous air for the better part of 30 million years before the asteroid ended that particular arrangement and began the next one. The Mesozoic world, in all its green and ancient and flowering complexity, held them both, the largest animals that have ever walked on land, and the most successful reproductive innovation in the history of plant life, sharing a planet that was, in the last chapter of the Age of Dinosaurs, more beautiful than it had ever been before. Rest here, in the warmth of the late Cretaceous afternoon, with the first flowers opening somewhere in the undergrowth, and the bees moving between them, and the smell of resin and nectar mixing in the warm and ancient air. The world is very full tonight, and very old, and very, very still. There is a particular quality of attention that the small things of the world require, different from the attention that large things command, which arrives almost automatically, almost without choice. The eye simply drawn to whatever is largest in the available field, simply because size, in the visual world, creates its own gravitational pull on the observing eye. The attention that small things require is something more deliberate, something slower, a willingness to lower your gaze from the dramatic heights of the Jurassic canopy, where the sauropod necks are sweeping their long and patient arcs through the upper vegetation, and direct it instead toward the undergrowth, toward the leaf litter, toward the narrow spaces between the roots of the tall conifers. where the light reaches only in thin and shifting bars, and where something small and quick is moving in a way that the large things above are too large to notice. And it is in that direction that we turn our attention tonight, away from the giants, into the small and the hidden and the overlooked. Because the Mesozoic world was not only the world of the great sauropods and the impressive theropods, whose size and drama have commanded the largest portion of the popular imagination since the first dinosaur bones were recognized as something entirely outside the frame of any previous understanding of what life on this planet had been. It was also a world filled in every available niche and at every available scale, with smaller, quieter, less immediately striking animals that lived their entire lives in the margins and the understories and the hidden spaces of the great Mesozoic landscape, and that have, as a consequence of their smallness and their ordinariness, received a fraction of the attention that their biology, examined on its own terms, and without the constant comparison to the giants above them, genuinely deserves. The smallest known dinosaur, or rather, the smallest known adult dinosaur, a qualification that the scientists who study these animals are careful to make, because many juvenile specimens of large species are found at sizes that would qualify as small if the animal's eventual adult dimensions were not already known from other specimens, was an animal called Microraptor, discovered in the fine-grained lake sediments of the Yishan Formation in China's Liaoning province, a formation that has proven to be one of the most extraordinarily productive fossil sites in the entire history of paleontology, preserving not just the bones of the animals that fell into the ancient lakes of the early Cretaceous, but, in many cases, the feathers and the soft tissue outlines and the stomach contents that tell us what those animals had been eating in the last hours before they died and sank into the oxygen-poor water that would preserve them so completely for the 120 million years between their deaths and their discovery. Microraptor was approximately 40 to 70 centimeters in length, roughly the size of a crow, which is itself, of course, a dinosaur, making the size comparison more phylogenetically appropriate than it might at first appear. And it possessed something that no other dinosaur, known before its discovery, had been shown to possess with such clear and complete evidence: 4 wings. Not 2 wings arranged in the manner of a modern bird, with the forelimbs modified into the primary flight surfaces and the hind limbs retained in their original bipedal walking function, but 4 separate feathered surfaces, 2 on the forelimbs and 2 on the hind limbs, arranged in a configuration that researchers who have studied its aerodynamic properties have suggested would have allowed this small and extraordinary animal a form of aerial locomotion intermediate between pure gliding and the fully powered flapping flight of modern birds. Not a bird yet, but something already exploring the possibilities of the air in ways that the animals below it in the Cretaceous undergrowth had never explored. Whether Microraptor launched itself from trees, climbing with its small, curved claws to height, and then extending its 4 feathered surfaces to glide between the trees of its forested environment, or whether it ran along the ground and leapt into the air in the way that some researchers believe powered flight first evolved in dinosaurs, is a question that the fossil evidence has not yet fully resolved, and that the researchers who study it continue to debate with the patient and meticulous care that questions of this kind require when the only available evidence is the beautifully preserved but necessarily incomplete record that the ancient lake beds of Liaoning have provided. What is not debated is the extraordinary quality of its preservation, because the Microraptor specimens found in Liaoning show the feathers in such fine detail that the microscopic structures within the feathers, the melanosomes, the pigment-containing structures that give feathers their color, have been preserved in some specimens well enough for researchers to use their shape and arrangement to reconstruct, with reasonable confidence, the color of the living animal's plumage, the same technique that has been applied to the feathers of other Liaoning dinosaurs, and that has, over the past decade or so, transformed our understanding of the visual world, of the small feathered dinosaurs of the Cretaceous, from pure speculation into something approaching genuine knowledge. Microraptor, based on this analysis, appears to have had plumage with an iridescent quality, a blue-black sheen produced by the particular arrangement of its melanosomes, similar to the iridescent sheen on the feathers of a modern starling or a raven, the color shifting and deepening as the angle of the light changed, a feature that implies a visual sophistication in these animals' perception of one another and of their environment that the earlier, purely skeletal reconstructions of feathered dinosaurs had given no reason to anticipate. A small animal, crow-sized, with 4 wings and iridescent blue-black plumage, moving through the early Cretaceous forests of what is now northeastern China, with a combination of climbing and gliding that no living animal quite replicates today, and preserved in the fine-grained sediment of an ancient lake, with enough fidelity that the color of its feathers can still be read from the microscopic structures of its melanosomes. 120 million years after the particular afternoon when it died and fell into the water, and began the long and extraordinary process of becoming something that a researcher in the 21st century would eventually find and study and understand. Allow that thought to rest somewhere quiet in your mind as we move deeper into the undergrowth of the Mesozoic, further along the forest floor, moving through the leaf litter with the quick and entirely practical efficiency of an animal that has no particular interest in being noticed, is a dinosaur that has been known to science since the 1960s, but that has received, in the popular literature of dinosaur discovery, a fraction of the attention that the dramatic and well-publicized finds of its larger contemporaries have generated. It is called Heterodontothaurus, the lizard with different teeth, and it was found in the early Jurassic rocks of South Africa's Hitangian beds, a small bipedal herbivore, approximately 1¼ meters in length, whose most remarkable feature, the feature that caused the researchers who first described it considerable productive confusion, is contained entirely within its mouth. Most dinosaurs, like most reptiles, had teeth that were essentially uniform throughout the jaw. Variations in size, certainly, and in curvature and in the precise details of the crown shape, but built on a single basic tooth design, repeated from the front of the mouth to the back. The entire dental battery performing a single basic function with variations of emphasis rather than kind. Heterodontosaurus had 3 entirely different types of teeth. At the very front of the upper jaw, small, simple teeth suited to cropping vegetation close to the ground, the cutting edge sharp enough to shear through the stems of the ferns and low-growing plants that the animal's size and posture placed within its reach. Behind these, in the region of the jaw, where the upper and lower teeth came into close contact during chewing, a set of broader, more complex teeth with a grinding surface, suited to the mechanical processing of the plant material that the front teeth had already cut free, a dental division of labor that is more characteristic of mammals than of the reptile-grade animals with which the early Jurassic was still well supplied. And between the cutting teeth at the front and the grinding teeth behind, on both the upper and lower jaws, a pair of enlarged, elongated teeth projecting downward and upward respectively, canine-like in their form and their prominence, whose function has generated more scientific discussion per unit of tooth than almost any other dental feature in the entire dinosaur fossil record. They may have been used in display, prominent and visible features of the animal's facial profile that communicated something to other members of the same species about the status or the reproductive condition of the individual that carried them, in the same way that the enlarged canines of many living mammals serve a social signaling function, alongside or instead of any direct mechanical purpose. They may have been sexually dimorphic, present in males but absent or reduced in females, the specimens without them representing one sex and the specimens with them representing the other, a hypothesis that some researchers have supported based on the distribution of the feature across the known specimens, though the pupil size remains too small for confident conclusions. Or they may simply have been the most efficient solution that the particular developmental program of this particular animal found to the problem of processing a varied diet in a small jaw with limited space for teeth, a functional solution that happened to produce a striking visual result that the animals themselves may or may not have used for social communication. The question has not been resolved, and may not be resolved until many more specimens are found and the full range of variation within the species can be properly characterized, which is itself a reminder that the science of paleontology is, in many of its most interesting questions, a science of incomplete information, working always from a sample of the past, that is, however rich and however informative, always smaller than the full reality it is trying to reconstruct. Further along the forest floor, in the damp and richly organic leaf litter of a late Jurassic conifer forest, a small animal moves with the quick and self-contained efficiency of something that has been successfully occupying exactly this ecological role. Small insectivore and small herbivore, moving through the rich layer of the forest floor for a very long time and has no reason to expect that it will not continue to do so. It is Compsognathus, one of the most well-known of the small dinosaurs, simply by virtue of being one of the first complete small dinosaur skeletons ever found, discovered in the fine-grained limestone of the Solnhofen Formation in Bavaria in the 19th century, preserved with an articulation and a completeness that allowed Richard Owen's colleague John Ostrom to later argue convincingly that this small and lightly built animal was, in certain key respects, the closest non-avian relative of the earliest birds, whose fossils were being found in the same Solnhofen deposits, a few geological layers above and below the Compsognathus beds. Approximately 60 centimeters in length, lightly built, with the long hind limbs and the short forelimbs of a dedicated biped, Compsognathus moved through the late Jurassic coastal landscape of what is now Bavaria, with the quick and alert economy of a small predator, whose survival depended on being faster than the small lizards and insects that constituted its diet, and more attentive to its surroundings than the larger predators that might, if given the opportunity, constitute it. One of the most famous Compsognathus specimens contains, preserved within the ribcage, in the position they occupied at the time of the animal's death, the remains of a small lizard, the last meal of a small predator, preserved in the stone with a completeness and a specificity that collapses the distance between that particular late Jurassic afternoon and this one, in the same way that the medullary bone of the 18-year-old Tyrannosaurus collapsed it in our chapter on the science of the Mesozoic, a small animal, on an ordinary afternoon, eating a small lizard, in the way that small animals on ordinary afternoons have always eaten small things, in the undergrowth of whatever world they happen to inhabit, from the late Jurassic coastal forests, of what would eventually become Bavaria to the garden outside your window, where something small is almost certainly moving through the leaf litter right now, eating something smaller than itself, in the ancient and entirely unhurried way of the small and the hidden and the overlooked. The small dinosaurs ask less of the imagination than the giants do. They do not require the mind to stretch, to accommodate dimensions it has no personal frame of reference for, no experiential equivalent to help it map the scale of a brachiosaurus neck against anything encountered in ordinary life. They simply ask for attention, the particular, deliberate, lowered gaze attention that the small things of the world have always required from anyone willing to provide it. And in return for that attention, they offer something the giants cannot quite provide: the intimacy of a life conducted at a scale the mind can hold completely, an individual existence fully visible in a single moment of imagining, a small animal moving through the leaf litter of a Mesozoic forest in the particular, self-contained, entirely ordinary way that small animals have always moved through the world. The leaf litter is very soft tonight. The light between the tall conifers is very dim, and somewhere in the undergrowth, something small is moving, quietly, going about its ancient and entirely unhurried business. In the warm and undisturbed dark of the Mesozoic night, the light is fading now, not in the abrupt and definitive way of a switch being turned, not in any way that announces itself or requires any particular response from the animals that have been going about their daylight business in the warm and productive hours of the Mesozoic afternoon, but in the slow and entirely familiar way that light has always faded at the end of every day that has ever occurred on this planet, the sun lowering toward the western horizon, and the quality of the light shifting very gradually from the direct and shadowless illumination of the middle hours toward the warmer, longer shadowed, more oblique light of the late afternoon, and then toward the particular deep gold of the last hour before sunset, and then toward the cooler blue of the first hour after it. The Mesozoic world is going to sleep, or rather, and this is the more accurate and more interesting thing to say, the Mesozoic world is changing shifts, because the darkness that is gathering now over the Cretaceous landscape we have been moving through together is not the darkness of a world pausing, or resting, or withdrawing from its own biological activity while the sun is absent. It is the darkness of a world whose nocturnal half is beginning to wake up, beginning to emerge from the cover and the shadow and the protective invisibility that the daylight hours imposed upon it, beginning to conduct, in the cool and quiet hours between sunset and dawn, the particular version of the Mesozoic's business that belongs to the night. Allow your breathing to slow to whatever pace feels most natural right now. Allow the weight of your body to rest more fully into wherever it rests tonight, the way the cooling Cretaceous air is resting, gently and without resistance, against the warm ground of the floodplain as the heat of the day begins its slow release back into the atmosphere. We have spent most of our journey tonight in the daylight world of the Mesozoic, in the warm and productive hours when the sauropods were moving through the Jurassic landscape and the small dinosaurs of the undergrowth were conducting their quick and alert business in the light filtering through the conifer canopy, and the flowers of the late Cretaceous were opening in the warm afternoon air for the newly evolved bees that were already, even in this earliest chapter of their long and continuing story, moving between them with the particular focused efficiency of animals that have found their work and are doing it. But the night world of the dinosaurs is, in certain respects, the most fascinating and the most recently illuminated chapter of the whole extraordinary story, because the tools that have allowed researchers to peer into the nocturnal behavior of animals that have been dead for 66 million years are tools that were only developed and refined in the past several decades, and the picture they have revealed has, in certain specific and surprising ways, required a significant revision of the assumptions that even professional paleontologists had been carrying about how the Mesozoic world distributed its activity across the 24 hours of each ancient day. The tool in question is called scleral ring analysis, and it is, in its basic concept, one of the more elegant examples in the whole of paleontology of a simple question yielding, when asked of the right evidence, an answer of unexpected richness and specificity. Many animals, including the birds that are the dinosaurs' living descendants, and including the non-avian dinosaurs themselves, have within their eyes a ring of small, overlapping bones called the scleral ring, which provides structural support to the eyeball and maintains the shape of the eye against the varying pressures that the visual system generates during the act of focusing at different distances. The diameter of the opening at the center of this ring, the aperture through which light enters the eye on its way to the retina, is directly related to the size of the pupil that the eye could open at maximum dilation, and the size of the maximum pupil dilation is, in turn, directly related to the conditions of illumination under which the animal was active. Animals that are active primarily in bright daylight conditions do not need large maximum pupil apertures, because the light available to them during their active hours is abundant enough that even a relatively small pupil opening admits sufficient light for clear vision. And correspondingly, their scleral ring opening is relatively small. Animals that are active primarily in low light conditions, at night or in the dim hours of dusk and dawn, require the ability to open their pupils as wide as possible to gather the maximum available light, and their scleral ring opening reflects this requirement, being proportionally much larger relative to the overall size of the eye. And animals that are active across a range of light conditions, or that have evolved a crepuscular pattern of activity, concentrated in the transitional light of dawn and dusk, show scleral ring dimensions intermediate between the two extremes, consistent with visual systems optimized neither for full daylight nor for full darkness, but for the particular quality of light that exists in the liminal hours between them. When researchers applied this analysis systematically to the scleral rings preserved in the fossil record of non-avian dinosaurs, and the scleral ring, being bone rather than soft tissue, preserves with considerable fidelity in many dinosaur specimens, the results were, in certain cases, genuinely surprising. Velociraptor, the small and feathered dromaeosaurid theropod of the late Cretaceous, whose popular reputation, considerably inflated by cinematic imagination beyond its actual modest dimensions, suggests an animal optimized for dramatic daytime encounters, shows scleral ring dimensions consistent with a nocturnal or strongly crepuscular pattern of activity. An animal whose eyes were built for low light conditions whose hunting was concentrated in the hours when the light was failing, or had already failed, when the diurnal prey animals that shared its landscape were at their most disoriented and their least visually effective. The large herbivores, the ceratopsians with their elaborate frills and their solid, low-slung bodies, show the scaleral ring dimensions of animals active across the full range of daylight conditions, consistent with a diurnal pattern that kept them feeding through the productive hours of the day and resting, in whatever way large herbivores rest, through the cooler and darker hours of the night. And some of the smaller ornithischian dinosaurs, the swift and lightly built bipedal herbivores that moved through the Cretaceous undergrowth, in the quick and alert manner of animals that rely on speed and attentiveness rather than size or armor for their survival, show the intermediate scaleral ring dimensions of crepuscular animals, their activity concentrated in the dawn and dusk hours, when the light was ambiguous enough to give them some advantage over both the full daylight predators that hunted by sight in bright conditions and the full darkness predators that hunted by other means in the hours of complete night. What this means, assembled from the scaleral ring evidence across the range of dinosaur species for which the relevant measurements have been made, is that the Mesozoic world was not a world that rested when the sun set. It was a world that reorganized itself, shifting the balance of its biological activity from one community of organisms to another as the light changed, in the same way that every healthy and complex ecosystem on Earth today reorganizes itself between the diurnal and the nocturnal communities that share the same landscape in the same 24 hours. The Cretaceous night, then, was alive, not with the same animals that had been active through the day. Though some animals, the crepuscular species whose active hours bridged both sides of the transition, were present in both communities, but with a different assembly of the Mesozoic's biological inhabitants, organized around the particular opportunities and challenges that darkness created. The small mammals were among the most important of the Mesozoic's nocturnal community. The shrew-like and mole-like, and in some cases surprisingly diverse, early mammals that had been present in the undergrowth since the Triassic, moving through the leaf litter and the root systems and the rotting wood of the forest floor in the hours when the large diurnal dinosaurs were resting, and building, across the long darkness of the Mesozoic, the behavioral flexibility and the sensory sophistication that would eventually, when the asteroid ended the non-avian dinosaurs' tenure and opened the ecological space that the Cenozoic made available, allow them to diversify into every available niche with the extraordinary speed that the early Cenozoic mammal fossil record documents. The Mesozoic night was the mammal's training ground, 66 million years of activity in the dark, developing the acute hearing and the sensitive whiskers and the complex olfactory systems and the enlarged brain regions dedicated to the processing of non-visual sensory information that would prove, when the opportunity finally arrived, to be exactly the toolkit that a rapidly diversifying group of opportunistic animals needed to fill an emptied world. The night sky above the Cretaceous landscape deserves a moment of quiet attention before we allow this chapter to settle into its close. There was no light pollution in the Cretaceous night. No cities, no roads, no single artificial light source of any kind anywhere on the planet. The darkness between the stars uncompeted with by anything the living world had yet produced. And the result was a night sky of a density and a richness that no human eye in the modern world is likely to ever have seen in full, because the places on the modern Earth remote enough from artificial light to offer a truly dark sky, are also, for the most part, places where the atmospheric conditions that produce the clearest views are not consistently available. The Cretaceous night sky was always clear of artificial light. Every star that the Cretaceous atmosphere could pass was visible. Every planet in its position along the ecliptic, the Milky Way stretching in its full and unobscured arc across the complete dome of the sky in the soft and ancient light that it has always cast over every night that has ever occurred on this planet, regardless of what was living on the surface beneath it. A velociraptor hunting in the Cretaceous dark would have had this sky above it, the same stars, in slightly different positions as the slow precession of the Earth's axis carried the constellations through their centuries-long cycle. But the same ancient light, the same vast and patient darkness between the points of light, the same quality of infinite depth that the night sky carries, whether you are looking at it from a Cretaceous floodplain or from the window of the room where you are resting tonight. The same sky, 66 million years apart. The Cretaceous night is very full of stars tonight. The nocturnal community of the Mesozoic is conducting its quiet business in the leaf litter and the lower branches and the dark river margins of the ancient landscape, and the small mammals are moving through the root systems of the forest floor. And somewhere in the middle distance, a velociraptor is moving through the Cretaceous dark, with the confident unhurriedness of an animal perfectly suited to exactly these conditions. And the stars above all of it are the same stars that are above you, older now, but still there, still casting their ancient and patient light over whatever night is happening beneath them, as they always have, as they always will. The late Cretaceous world is very full tonight, fuller in certain measurable respects than it has ever been before in the entire long history of the Mesozoic. More species of dinosaur alive simultaneously, more diversity of form and ecological role and behavioral strategy, distributed across a wider range of environments than at any previous point in the 165 million years that the dinosaur family tree had been branching and diversifying and finding its way into every available corner of the living world. The ceratopsians, the horned and frilled dinosaurs whose elaborate facial ornamentation represents one of the most extraordinary examples of evolutionary diversification in the entire fossil record, were, in the last few million years before the end, producing new species at a rate that the geological record of their diversity makes almost dizzying to contemplate. Each new lineage experimenting with a slightly different arrangement of horns and frills and facial bosses, the whole family radiating outward through the available ecological space of the late Cretaceous, with the vigorous and entirely unconscious creativity of a group that had found its particular biological formula and was exploring its every possible variation. The hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, the good mothers and fathers whose nesting colonies in the Montana Badlands we visited in our chapter on the science of the Mesozoic, were moving through the late Cretaceous landscapes of North America and Asia in herds of a size that the trackway evidence and the bonebed deposits suggest were among the largest aggregations of large animals that any terrestrial ecosystem has ever supported. Their passage through the coastal plain environments of the late Cretaceous, leaving behind the kind of physical evidence, disturbed soil, stripped vegetation, extensive trackway systems that only very numerous animals moving together can produce. The ankylosaurs were there, moving with the slow and armored confidence of animals whose entire bodies had been converted, across millions of years of evolutionary refinement, into a defensive system so complete that the largest predators of the late Cretaceous faced a genuine mechanical challenge in overcoming it, their backs covered in the interlocking bony plates and spikes of a living fortress, their tails ending in the most derived species, in a mass of fused bone capable of delivering a blow sufficient to break the leg of a Tyrannosaurus rex. The anatomy of certain tyrannosaur leg bones having been found in some specimens to show healed fractures consistent with exactly this kind of injury. And the tyrannosaurs themselves were there, at the apex of the food web, as they had been for the last 20 million years of the Cretaceous, occupying the role of largest predator in the North American ecosystem, with the combination of enormous size, acute senses, and the particular combination of speed and power that made them, in the considered judgment of most paleontologists who have studied the mechanics of their hunting in detail, the most formidably equipped large predators that the Mesozoic ever produced. This was the world of 66 million years ago, diverse, productive, biologically rich, in a way that rivaled any ecosystem the modern world contains, and entirely unaware, as all worlds are entirely unaware of everything except what their immediate chemistry and physics and biological interactions are, moment by moment, presenting to the sensory systems of the animals moving through them, of what was coming. Allow your body to settle a little more fully into the surface beneath it now, the way the sediments of the late Cretaceous were settling, particle by patient particle, onto the floors of the shallow inland seas and the coastal plains of the ancient world, building, in their slow and entirely unhurried way, the rock record that would eventually, 66 million years later, be the primary evidence from which the story of this world and its ending would be reconstructed. The asteroid that struck the Yucatan Peninsula of what is now Mexico 66 million years ago was approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, roughly the width of a large city, traveling through space at a velocity somewhere between 20 and 30 kilometers per second. And the energy released at the moment of impact was, by the calculations of the researchers who have spent considerable time with the physics of this particular collision, equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons detonated simultaneously at a single point on the Earth's surface. But the story of what this impact meant for the world is not, in its most important dimensions, a story about that single moment. It is a story about what followed. The impact itself was, for the animals within the immediate affected region of the Yucatan and the surrounding areas, a catastrophic and rapid event. The thermal pulse of the impact, the seismic disturbance propagating through the crust, the enormous tsunami generated by an impact in a shallow coastal sea. These were regional disasters of extraordinary severity that ended the lives of the animals in their immediate vicinity in the hours and days following the collision. But the global consequences of the impact, the consequences that would eventually end the non-avian dinosaurs, not just in the Yucatan, but across every continent and every ocean and every ecosystem on the planet, unfolded slowly, over months, over years, in the particular slow and patient way of atmospheric and ecological processes operating at the scale of an entire planet. The impact ejected an enormous quantity of material into the atmosphere: vaporized rock, pulverized debris, soot from the wildfires that the thermal pulse ignited across vast areas of the adjacent landscape. And this material, lofted high enough into the stratosphere that the normal processes of precipitation and gravity could not rapidly remove it, spread across the weeks and months following the impact into a global layer of particulate matter that reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface to a fraction of what it had been before. The plants, dependent on sunlight for photosynthesis, began to die, not all at once, and not in every part of the world equally. The impact's effects on the global atmosphere were distributed unevenly by the circulation patterns of the Cretaceous atmosphere, and some regions experienced more severe light reduction than others. And some plant communities, with their seed banks and their underground root systems and their various strategies for surviving periods of reduced photosynthetic activity, were more resistant to the disruption than others. But the trend was clear and consistent, and, for the animals at the upper levels of food webs that depended on the continuous productivity of plant communities, ultimately decisive. The large herbivores that needed to eat continuously to sustain their enormous bodies found the vegetation they depended on becoming scarce in a way that no previous seasonal or climatic fluctuation had prepared them for. The predators that depended on the large herbivores found their prey becoming rarer, and the cascade moved, slowly and without drama, through the entire structure of the late Cretaceous ecosystem, in the way that ecological cascades always move through complex food webs when the foundational productivity of the system is reduced below the level that the system's upper tiers require. The non-avian dinosaurs did not die dramatically. They died the way all animals die when the world stops providing what they need, quietly, in ones and in small numbers, over the months and years of a world that was offering less than it had before. And that was not going to return to what it had been. The last non-avian dinosaur was probably not aware of being the last. It simply went about whatever the final version of its ordinary life looked like, in whatever diminished and disrupted landscape the years following the impact had left to it, until the particular combination of scarcity and exposure and physiological stress that the changed world imposed on its body exceeded what that body could sustain. And then it was gone, and with it, the last direct connection to a world that had been continuously and uninterruptedly inhabited by non-avian dinosaurs for approximately 165 million years was severed, and the Mesozoic era ended not with any ceremony or announcement, but simply with the cessation of something that had been the most constant and most defining feature of terrestrial life on this planet, for longer than any other group of large animals has ever managed. But this is not the end of the story. It is, in certain important respects, the beginning of the most extraordinary chapter of it, because among the animals that survived the impact winter and the years of ecological disruption that followed were the avian dinosaurs, the birds, already diverse and already globally distributed by the late Cretaceous, already possessing the combination of small body size and metabolic flexibility and behavioral adaptability that would prove, in the changed world of the early Paleogene, to be exactly the characteristics that survival required. The birds survived because they were small enough that their food requirements could be met by the reduced productivity of a disrupted ecosystem, because they were warm-blooded enough to maintain their body temperature through the cooler conditions that reduced sunlight created, because they were behaviorally flexible enough to shift their diets toward the seeds and insects and other resources that persisted through the disruption when the specific foods they had been eating disappeared. And the mammals, those small, nocturnal generalist survivors that had spent the entire Mesozoic in the undergrowth and the darkness, building their sensory sophistication and their behavioral flexibility across 66 million years of careful, inconspicuous survival in a world dominated by animals much larger than themselves, survived for the same reasons and found themselves, in the early years of the Paleogene, in a world that had suddenly opened every large ecological role to the first animals capable of filling them. The transformation that followed was, in geological terms, rapid. Within 10 million years of the impact, a span of time that is, by the standards of the evolutionary timescales we have been moving through together tonight, relatively brief. The mammals had diversified into the roles of large herbivore and large predator and everything in between, occupying the ecological space that the non-avian dinosaurs had vacated. With the thoroughness and the variety that a group carrying 66 million years of adaptive preparation was equipped to achieve. But the birds, the avian dinosaurs, the surviving branch of the most successful group of land animals this planet has ever produced, did not simply persist through the transformation. They thrived. They diversified alongside the mammals, finding new ecological roles in the changed world and elaborating their already extraordinary biological toolkit. The flight that the small feathered theropods of the Cretaceous had pioneered, the acute senses, the complex social behaviors, the parental investment that went all the way back to the Maiasaura nesting colonies of the Montana Badlands, into the 10,000 species of living birds that represent, on any honest accounting, the most successful group of large land animals alive on Earth today. The dinosaurs did not lose. They transformed, and the transformation has been continuing, quietly and without interruption, through every one of the 66 million years between the last late Cretaceous morning and this one, producing, from the feathered and warm-blooded and parentally attentive foundation that the non-avian dinosaurs laid, the extraordinary diversity of living birds that are conducting their own nocturnal business somewhere outside your window right now, as they have conducted it every night of your entire life, entirely unconcerned with the immensity of the story that connects their particular Tuesday evening to the world we have been traveling through together. The story did not end. It simply continued in a different form, as stories do, as life does, in the patient and entirely unhurried way that this planet has always conducted the most important of its long and continuing processes. Simply here, simply continuing, in the warm dark of another evening, on an ancient and resilient Earth that has always found a way, we have arrived at last at tonight. Not the late Cretaceous tonight, not the Jurassic tonight, not the spare and recovering quiet of the Triassic night, where our journey began so many hours ago in the undergrowth of a world, still finding its way back from the largest extinction in the history of complex life, but this tonight, the one you are actually in, the one whose particular darkness is surrounding you right now as you rest here in the long and patient company of everything this documentary has been moving through together. We have come all the way through 252 million years of geological time, through the recovery of the post-Permian world, and the first tentative footsteps of the earliest dinosaurs in the red-rocked Triassic landscape, through the extraordinary scale and warmth and productivity of the Jurassic, through the diversifying richness of the Cretaceous, with its first flowers and its first bees, and its hadrosaur nesting colonies, and its nocturnal velociraptor moving through the starlit dark, with its scaleral ring-evidenced night vision fully engaged, through the slow and undramatic ending of the non-avian dinosaurs and the long transformation that followed it, And we have arrived here, where the dinosaurs are outside your window. Allow the weight of that thought to settle over you now, not as a surprising or stimulating thought, but as a comfortable and reassuring one. The thought of something ancient and continuous, and entirely present in the ordinary world of this particular evening. The thought of an unbroken lineage extending from the Triassic undergrowth to the branch outside your window, without a single gap, without a single generation in which the thread was cut and had to be restarted from nothing. The thread was never cut. It simply changed what it was made of, slowly and continuously, across 66 million years of change that altered the form without interrupting the continuity. The birds that are resting somewhere outside your window tonight carry, within their bodies, the physical inheritance of everything we have spent this night exploring, and the inventory of that inheritance, examined with the careful attention it deserves, is one of the most quietly extraordinary things in the whole of natural history. The bones of a bird are hollow, not hollow in a way that compromises their structural integrity, but hollow in the precisely engineered way of bones invaded by the extensions of an air sac system connected to the respiratory apparatus. Pneumatized in the same fundamental way that the vertebrae of the sauropods we spent so much time with were pneumatized. The same basic biological solution to the same basic biological problem of maintaining structural strength, while minimizing the weight that the flying body must carry through the air. A solution so effective, so elegantly balanced between the competing demands of lightness and strength, that the evolutionary lineage that found it in the Mesozoic has never had occasion to abandon it in the 66 million years since. The wishbone, that familiar structure at the base of the neck of any bird, the furcula, whose two arms flex and spring back during the flight stroke, to store and release elastic energy in the way of a biological spring, assisting the enormous muscular effort of sustained flapping flight, is a structure whose origins in the dinosaur lineage predate the evolution of flight by tens of millions of years. Present in the theropod dinosaurs of the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, in essentially the same form it takes in the birds of tonight, serving in those early theropods a function related to the anchoring of the shoulder musculature that only later, as the lineage moved toward flight, was elaborated into the flight-assisting spring that modern birds depend upon. Every Thanksgiving table in every country where turkeys are eaten contains, in the wishbone that two people pull apart for luck, a structure that was already present in the bodies of the ancestors of those turkeys in the late Jurassic period, more than 150 million years ago, doing its original theropod work of anchoring the muscles of the forelimb to the bones of the chest in an animal that had not yet learned to fly, and would not, for another 80 million years or so, begin the long evolutionary process of discovering that the structures it already possessed could, with modification, carry it into the air. The three-toed foot, the primary foot arrangement of the vast majority of living birds. 3 toes extending forward from the central joint and 1 toe, reduced or vestigial in many species, extending backward, is the same basic foot arrangement that the bipedal theropod dinosaurs of the Mesozoic left in their trackways across the mudflats and floodplains of the ancient world. The same 3-toed impression that allows paleontologists to identify a dinosaur trackway from the shape of the print alone, the same arrangement visible in the tracks that any bird leaves in soft mud or fresh snow on any ordinary morning anywhere on Earth. Feathers, whose origins in the theropod lineage we followed back, through the extraordinary preservation of the Liaoning Formation to the iridescent plumage of Microraptor and the feathered tails preserved in Cretaceous amber, are structures whose basic architecture has remained remarkably stable across the full span of their evolutionary history. The interlocking barbs and barbules of a modern flight feather operating on the same physical principle as the feathers of the earliest feathered theropods, refined and elaborated across millions of years of selection for flight performance, but recognizably continuous with the structures that first appeared in the Jurassic, in animals that used them for insulation and display rather than for flight, and the parental behavior, the nesting, the incubation, the provisioning of the young, the fierce and patient attendance of the adults through the vulnerable weeks of the chick's development that the Maiasaura bone beds recorded in such moving detail, continues in birds, in forms whose elaboration and diversity across the 10,000 living species of the avian world represents perhaps the most extraordinary behavioral inheritance that any evolutionary lineage has ever passed forward across deep time. Allow your breathing to grow very slow and very easy here in the quiet of this late hour, and simply rest for a moment in the knowledge of all of this continuity before we spend the final portion of this chapter with the specific living dinosaurs, whose biology carries the inheritance of the Mesozoic in the most striking and the most readily observable ways. The crow or the raven, either will do, because the cognitive story they tell is, in its essential dimensions, the same story, told by two closely related members of the family Corvidae that have, across their own evolutionary history, developed the largest brain-to-body ratio of any bird family and some of the most remarkable cognitive capabilities documented in any non-human animal. Crows and ravens use tools, not in the opportunistic and relatively simple way that some other tool-using animals use tools, picking up a convenient object and employing it once for a single purpose, and then abandoning it, but in the deliberate and planned and sometimes multi-step way of animals that appear to form a mental representation of a goal, select or modify a tool appropriate to achieving that goal, and in some cases carry that tool from one location to another in anticipation of needing it at a future time in a future place. New Caledonian crows manufacture hooks from plant stems, bending the material with their beaks into a specific shape that allows them to probe for insect larvae in narrow crevices, and the hooks they manufacture show consistent structural features across individuals, suggesting a learned and culturally transmitted technique rather than a randomly discovered individual behavior. A tradition passed from generation to generation through observation and practice in a bird whose evolutionary lineage connects it through 66 million years of unbroken descent to the small and quick and alert theropods of the Cretaceous undergrowth. Ravens recognize individual human faces and remember them across years, adjusting their behavior towards specific humans based on the history of their interactions. Trusting the humans who have previously behaved reliably toward them, avoiding or displaying wariness toward those who have not, and in some documented cases, appearing to communicate information about specific humans to other ravens who have not themselves had direct experience with those individuals. The cognitive architecture that underlies these capabilities, the neural structures and the behavioral flexibility and the capacity for something that functions in its outcomes, if not necessarily in its subjective character, very like planning and memory and social information transmission, is the cognitive architecture of an animal whose ancestors were navigating the complex social and ecological challenges of the Mesozoic world with the same basic neural toolkit, refined and elaborated across 66 million years of selection for exactly the kind of flexible, generalized intelligence that allows a small-bodied animal to survive and thrive in a wide range of conditions. The crow is the Mesozoic's mind continuing, and at the other end of the spectrum of living dinosaur biology, at the extreme of smallness that the avian lineage has explored as thoroughly as it has explored the extreme of cognitive complexity, is the hummingbird, the smallest living dinosaur, a creature whose biology operates at the most extreme metabolic intensity of any warm-blooded animal alive, its heart beating at rest at somewhere between 500 and 1200 times per minute, depending on the species, its wings beating at between 10 and 80 times per second, depending on the species and the maneuver being performed, its body temperature maintained at levels that would constitute a dangerous fever in any mammal, its entire existence conducted at a pace and an intensity that makes the slow and patient sauropods we spent so much time with earlier tonight seem, by comparison, to be moving through a world operating at an entirely different temporal scale. A hummingbird visits between 1,000 and 2,000 flowers in a single day. It consumes, in the nectar and insects that constitute its diet, an amount of food equivalent to more than twice its own body weight every 24 hours, a metabolic demand so extreme that it cannot be sustained through the night. And so the hummingbird enters, each evening, a state of torpor so deep that its metabolic rate drops to approximately 5% of its waking value, its heart rate slowing from hundreds of beats per minute to fewer than 50, its body temperature dropping to within a few degrees of the ambient temperature of the air around it. The whole extraordinary biological machinery of the world's most energetically intense, warm-blooded animal temporarily suspended in a stillness so complete that early observers, finding hummingbirds in torpor, sometimes believed the animals were dead. And each morning, the hummingbird warms itself back to full operating temperature, its metabolism ramping back up from its overnight minimum to its extraordinary daytime intensity, in a process that takes 20 to 60 minutes and consumes a significant portion of whatever energy reserves the previous day's feeding has accumulated, and then it goes back out into the world and visits its 1,000 flowers and does everything again, every day, for the entirety of its small and extraordinarily intense life. In continuous, unbroken, metabolically ferocious descent from the warm-blooded theropod dinosaurs of the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, who were themselves conducting their lives at metabolic rates that the bone histology record now tells us were far more similar to the hummingbird's end of the warm-blooded spectrum than to the cold-blooded reptile end that the early history of dinosaur science assumed. And then there is the ordinary bird, the sparrow, the pigeon, the wren that moves through the hedge at the end of the garden in the particular quick and self-contained way of a small bird, entirely occupied with the business of being a small bird in a world that provides, on any ordinary day, everything a small bird requires to conduct its small and ancient and entirely sufficient life. This bird, the most ordinary bird, the bird whose existence is so constant and so unremarkable that it takes a deliberate act of attention to actually see it rather than simply registering its presence and moving on, is the inheritor of everything, of the hollow bones and the wishbone and the three-toed feet and the feathers and the parental attention and the warm blood and the acute senses, Of the 66 million years of avian evolution that followed the impact winter, of the 165 million years of non-avian dinosaur history that preceded it, of the recovery of the post-Permian world, and the first small archosaurs moving through the Triassic undergrowth, with their efficient, upright gait and their unassuming confidence in the particular version of the future that their biology was already, without their knowledge, beginning to build. This ordinary bird, resting somewhere outside your window tonight, is the end of a story 250 million years in the making. Or rather, not the end, simply the current expression of a story that has never ended and shows no sign of ending, and that will continue to produce its next chapter in the same patient and unhurried and entirely unconscious way that all of the chapters before it were produced, simply by living things, living their lives in whatever world the current moment provides, and passing forward into the next generation everything that has allowed them to live those lives as fully and as continuously as they have. The bird outside your window is a dinosaur, resting in the dark, carrying everything forward, as it always has, as it always will. The sky is beginning to change. Not this sky, not the particular sky outside your window on this particular night. Though that sky too will begin its own slow change before very long, the darkness softening at its eastern edge in the first and most tentative suggestion of the morning that is already somewhere beyond the horizon, beginning its patient approach. But another sky, the sky above a Cretaceous morning, somewhere in what will eventually become the inland plains of North America. In the last long chapter of the age we have been traveling through together, the air still carrying the particular warmth and humidity of a late Cretaceous dawn, the conifer forest at the edge of the floodplain, still holding its deep and resinous dark, the river moving in its slow and braided course through the pale sediment of the plain. The darkness is softening in the east, very slowly. The first pale differentiation of sky from horizon, so subtle that only the eye already watching for it would notice the change. A deepening of the eastern dark into something slightly less dark, slightly less complete in its refusal of light. And in the undergrowth at the edge of the conifer forest, something small is waking, a small feathered shape stirring on a branch in the particular way of a bird waking from the night's stillness, the feathers ruffling briefly against the cool dawn air and then settling, the head lifting from where it rested, tucked against the body's warmth, the eyes opening onto a Cretaceous morning that looks, in this first pale light, very much like the morning it will always have been. It does not know what it is. It does not know that it is a dinosaur, or that the lineage it belongs to is about to survive something that will end the lineage of almost everything else sharing its world, or that the 66 million years stretching ahead of it will carry its descendants, unbroken, to a morning very much like this one. It simply wakes, in the way that living things have always woken, into whatever morning the night has produced. The light is growing now, slowly, the eastern horizon holding its pale and patient glow above the dark line of the conifer forest. The sky above it deepening from the near black of the last of the night toward the deep blue that always precedes the actual arrival of the sun. The stars fading one by one in the west as the light that is coming makes them, one by one, unnecessary. A sound. A single, simple call from the small feathered shape in the undergrowth, offered into the Cretaceous dawn without any particular audience in mind. Simply the sound of a living thing, marking the beginning of another day, in the way that living things have always marked the beginning of another day. And then the sun clears the horizon, the same sun that will clear the horizon above your window before very long, older now by 66 million years, but the same, casting its same ancient light over a world that has changed almost beyond recognition and yet carries, in its birds and its mornings, and the particular quality of light at dawn, the deep and continuous memory of everything it has ever been. The dinosaurs are still here. They have always been here. And they will be here tomorrow morning, calling from the branches before the alarm sounds, passing across the early sky in their unhurried formations, going about the ancient and ordinary and entirely sufficient business of being alive in a world that has been sustaining them in one form or another for longer than the imagination can hold without softening. Rest now. The morning is coming, as it always comes, patient, unhurried, and full as it has always been full of dinosaurs.